What if the boy who lived was never raised by the Dursleys, but by the greatest detective in history, Sherlock Holmes? Imagine Harry Potter growing up not just with magic, but with sharp observation, cold logic, and a mind trained to solve every mystery in front of him. At Hogwarts, he wouldn't just survive dark secrets, he would investigate them. In this video, I've divided the full story into 6 chapters so you can follow the flow of the story properly. So make sure to subscribe, leave a like, and share the video, because this is Harry Potter like you've never seen before.
Chapter 1. The Anomaly at Baker Street the night Albus Dumbledore left Harry Potter on a doorstep. London was sleeping badly. It had been raining on and off since midnight, the thin, needling kind of rain that slicked the pavement without ever becoming honest enough to call itself a storm. Privet Drive sat under it with the smug stillness of a place that believed misfortune happened elsewhere. Its hedges were cut with military precision. Its windows were dark in synchronized rows. Its residents had the settled confidence of people who thought normality was a fortress. Sherlock Holmes disliked places like that on principle. He moved through the sleeping street with his coat collar turned up and his hands in his pockets, looking like a man taking an idle walk and thinking about nothing at all. In reality, his mind was occupied by 3 separate burglaries in South London, a forged shipping invoice in Limehouse, and the very specific way the large man ahead of him was trying and failing to walk quietly. The man's size made silence impossible. Not the total silence Sherlock would have expected from a practiced criminal, but the softer, more deliberate silence of someone attempting not to alarm sleepers. Boots placed carefully, weight shifted with effort. Breath held on exhale near the garden gates. Not stealth then, restraint. More interestingly, the man was not alone. There had been others here minutes earlier. Sherlock could read it in the street. The impressions on the wet pavement were confused now, but sufficient. One belonged to an elderly man with a lighter step than his age should have allowed. Another belonged to a woman whose heels never properly touched down, as though she had a habit of turning before she had fully stopped. There had also been something else. No footprint, no tire impression, yet a pattern in the water disturbed on the curb, and the strange, localized settling of mist that suggested displacement by something large. Transport of some kind, unusual. Sherlock stopped at the mouth of Privet Drive and watched. The large man, half hidden now in the dark, stood near number 4 with a figure Sherlock could not yet clearly see. There was a pause, a brief exchange. Then there came a roar from above, a mechanical snarl cutting through the wet quiet, and something impossible rose into the sky. Sherlock's head tilted, a motorbike. Flying, not leaping, not launched from a ramp. Ascending, he watched it vanish into low cloud without blinking. Then and only then did he walk forward. The old man and the woman were already gone. Number 4 remained. A neat brick house, lace curtains. A brass number polished recently. A child-sized bundle on the doorstep. Sherlock crouched, wool blanket, hand-stitched, expensive yarn but homemade. The sort of work produced by care rather than commerce. Infant male, approximately 15 months old. Well-fed, not neglected, breathing evenly despite the weather. No sign of current illness. A letter tucked into the folds, sealed but not secured. And on the child's forehead Sherlock leaned closer. A scar in the precise shape of a lightning bolt, not accidental, not surgical, not any ordinary trauma. It had healed too cleanly and too strangely, the edges faintly silvered under the porch light. Tissue memory, a burn that had not burned. A wound that had behaved like a signature. Sherlock studied it for exactly 4 minutes. Then he removed the letter, broke the seal, and read. His expression did not change. It rarely did. But something in him settled into place with the faint, internal click of a mechanism finding its correct setting. So, a hidden world. A dead couple. A child placed with relatives because of some inherited protective principle. A decision made, apparently, without the slightest inquiry into whether those relatives were fit custodians. Sloppy. He slid the letter into his coat pocket, lifted the child with efficient care, and walked to the door. When he knocked, The house took a long time to answer. Inside, floorboards creaked. A chain slid. The door opened 3 inches and revealed a large man in a mustard dressing gown with a face already swelling with indignation. The indignation faltered when he saw the bundle. Sherlock took in the widened eyes, the blanching skin. The glance instinctively flicked past the child toward the street as though checking whether neighbors had seen. Not fear for the boy. Fear of inconvenience. Fear of scandal. Case closed. The child, Sherlock said, was left on your step by a giant on a flying motorbike at approximately 1:47 this morning. I gather you were expected to take him in. Vernon Dursley stared. Sherlock continued in the tone one might use to explain weather to an idiot. You were hoping, I suspect, to discover him at a socially acceptable hour, perform a display of reluctant decency for the benefit of the neighbors, and then quietly redirect him into institutional care before he became your problem. I find that plan insufficiently humane. What? Said Vernon. Quite. Sherlock shifted the child slightly. Harry made a small sound in his sleep but did not wake. You are relieved of the burden. Good evening. He turned and started down the path. Oi! Vernon barked, outrage arriving half a second behind confusion. You can't just... Sherlock stopped at the gate and looked back over his shoulder. Rain silvered the edge of his profile. I can, he said pleasantly, and I have. Then he walked away. Mrs. Hudson opened the door to 221B Baker Street wearing a shawl, a hairnet, and the expression of a woman who had seen too much nonsense in her life to be surprised by new varieties of it. That expression lasted until she saw the child. Mr. Holmes, she said. Mrs. Hudson. She glanced at the sleeping infant in Sherlock's arms, then at Sherlock's face, then back to the infant. Her eyes narrowed with the speed of a woman rearranging the next 48 hours of her life. You've brought home a baby. Yes. Why? He was left on a doorstep in Surrey as part of what appears to be an improvised arrangement by a concealed magical society whose judgment I currently distrust. Mrs. Hudson blinked once. Of course you have. She stepped aside. Come in before the poor thing freezes. By 4 in the morning, Baker Street had been transformed. A cot appeared from the attic. Blankets were warmed. Milk was procured by means Sherlock did not investigate because he knew from experience that Mrs. Hudson's logistical competence outclassed most governments. A kettle whistled. A fire was built up. Sherlock had Harry settled in a basket near the sitting-room hearth while he reread the letter 3 times and made notes in a black casebook already labeled Harry Potter. At 4:30, Doctor. John Watson arrived in his shirt-sleeves, summoned by a messenger who had banged on his door until he'd threatened legal action and then recognized Sherlock's handwriting on the note. Watson entered, took one look at the basket and stopped short. Sherlock, he said. Why is there a child in your sitting room? Sherlock did not look up from his notes. Because leaving him on an unfit doorstep struck me as inefficient. Watson stared at him for a long moment, then at the baby, then at Mrs. Hudson, who was warming a bottle with the solemn focus of a surgeon. And you brought him here? Yes. Watson removed his spectacles, polished them, and put them back on in case the child vanished. Harry remained stubbornly real. I see, he said at last. No, you don't, said Sherlock, but you may begin. There is a hidden society composed of magic practitioners. This infant's parents were murdered last night by a prominent figure within that society. The murderer attempted to kill the child and failed under circumstances not yet understood. An elderly man of influence elected to leave the infant with these relatives. He tapped the folded letter with 2 fingers, whose probable response would have been emotional neglect at best. I intercepted. Watson looked at him, then, very slowly, he smiled. Did you? He said. Now, Sherlock finally glanced up. You disapprove, my dear fellow, said Watson, crossing to the fire and peering into the basket with immense tenderness. I haven't decided whether I disapprove, but I am increasingly certain you've kidnapped the boy who lived. Mrs. Hudson, who had just finished feeding Harry, turned sharply. The what? A phrase from the letter. Sherlock said. Apparently the child is notable. Harry opened his eyes then. It was not dramatic. No thunder cracked. No portentous wind shook the windows. He simply woke, blinked at the firelight, and fixed Sherlock Holmes with a calm, clear gaze far too direct for a baby not yet 2 years old. Sherlock held that gaze. Harry did not cry. Interesting. His name, Mrs. Hudson announced, checking the letter again, is Harry Potter. An adequate name, Sherlock said. Mrs. Hudson gave him a look that clearly meant he would not be renaming the child after a Roman emperor or a violinist. Watson crouched by the basket. "Hello there, Harry," he murmured. Harry reached up and caught Watson's finger with surprising force. Watson's expression softened instantly into something that made Sherlock look away and pretend to adjust the lamp. The scar caught the light again. Sherlock leaned in, studied it beneath the yellow glow, then crossed to the side table and opened his casebook. Scar tissue atypical, residual activity suspected, not a wound only. Possibly a record of energetic event. He paused, tapped the pen once against the page, and wrote beneath it, question. What sort of world leaves a child on a doorstep with a note and calls it protection? Harry remained at Baker Street because no one arrived to claim him. That, Sherlock thought, was answer enough. There were signs, of course, that the magical world knew where he was. An owl appeared 2 days later and tried to peck through the sitting-room glass before Mrs. Hudson let it in, and Sherlock relieved it of a very officious letter requesting a conversation at the earliest convenience. Sherlock wrote back declining the request until he had completed his preliminary assessment of the child's welfare and the correspondent's competence. The owl bit him. He made a note of that as well. No one came in person. No one pressed the issue with sufficient urgency to challenge his custody. There were, Sherlock concluded, either political reasons for caution or arrogance so complete that they expected their first assumption to prevail eventually. Either way, the result was the same. Harry stayed. And Harry Potter grew up unlike any other child in London. He learned letters early because there were always books within reach, and because Sherlock, despite claiming not to enjoy teaching, could not resist any mind that showed speed. He learned numbers before nursery rhymes and pattern recognition before proper table manners. Mrs. Hudson saw to the table manners. Watson saw to the ordinary human things boots that fit, stories before bed when the storms were loud, the simple miracle of being looked at with warmth rather than analysis. Sherlock taught him to look. At 3, Harry sat on a stool beside the window and was told to describe passers-by. Not what you think, Sherlock said, drawing his violin bow lazily across the strings in between questions. What you know. Harry squinted at the woman on the opposite pavement. She's sad, inadmissible, support it. She's walking fast, but not going anywhere important. If she had somewhere important, she'd have fixed her collar in the reflection. She didn't, and she's holding a letter too tightly, so she's read something bad. Sherlock lowered the violin. Better! At 4, Harry was shown Watson's old military trunk and asked to infer its history. Army? Harry said at once. Obviously. Continue. Not new army, old army, the leather's repaired but by hand, not factory. Someone kept it because it mattered, not because it was useful. And, he leaned closer, and Dr. Watson limps more when it rains, and he always gets quiet when he opens this drawer. So it has war things in it. Sherlock's eyes flicked to Watson. Watson, sitting with a medical journal by the fire, looked over the rim of it and smiled. Extraordinary child. Observant child, Sherlock corrected, though his tone suggested satisfaction. Harry grinned, because by then he already understood that satisfaction was praise in Sherlock's language. At 5, the lessons became games. Sherlock would take him to cafes and have him guess professions from hands, shoes, and posture. Not in a cruel way. Never for humiliation. It was never about mocking weakness. It was about training the eye to register what most people missed because they were too busy interpreting before they had observed. The gentleman by the window, Sherlock murmured one morning over tea. Harry looked. He's waiting. 4. A phone call? Evidence? He keeps checking the phone but doesn't unlock it, so he doesn't expect a message, he expects it to ring. His coffee's cold because he ordered it to stay sitting, and his shoes are muddy but not London muddy. Lighter, chalky. He came from outside the city. Sherlock watched the man for another 5 seconds, then nodded once. Further, Harry frowned, thinking hard. He shaved badly, not because he's untidy, because he was shaking. His eyes narrowed. His wedding ring is gone, but there's still a mark, so either he took it off recently or— Harry's voice went quieter, or his wife died. Sherlock was silent, then, "Finish your toast." That was, Watson later told Mrs. Hudson, practically a standing ovation. The odd things began slowly. At first, they were the sort of incidents adults told themselves had explanations. At 3, Mrs. Hudson put Harry down for a nap in his small room and found him 20 minutes later in the kitchen, seated serenely on the counter and attempting to reach the biscuit tin. There was no chair nearby, no drag marks on the floor, no possible route. Mrs. Hudson stared. Harry looked up guilelessly with crumbs already on his sleeve. "How did you get there?" Harry considered. "I wanted biscuits." Sherlock called in at once, examined the room, the floorboards, the windows, the distance from cot to counter, then opened his casebook. Event 1. Impossible relocation. Subject motivated by desire. No witnesses. At 4, Harry lost spectacularly at chess. Sherlock did not permit him easy victories. He dismantled Harry's opening in 7 moves, trapped his queen in 3 more, and finished with a quiet, merciless checkmate. Harry glared at the board. Every chess piece jumped an inch straight upward and scattered across the room. Watson swore. Mrs. Hudson dropped her knitting. Sherlock did neither. He simply looked at the pieces, then at Harry, then at the scar. "Fascinating," he said. Harry's anger evaporated into astonishment. "Did I do that?" "Almost certainly." "Can I do it again?" "We will not," said Mrs. Hudson firmly. "Be throwing chessmen around the sitting room as part of your education." Sherlock made a diagram anyway. At 6, a boy at school called Harry a freak. The boy's shoelaces knotted themselves together so comprehensively that 2 teachers, 1 janitor, and an amateur sailor could not undo them. The knot pattern was so intricate it looked intentional, yet Harry had been standing 6 feet away with his hands visible. When told of the incident, Sherlock asked only one question. "How angry were you?" Harry hesitated. "Quite." Sherlock nodded and wrote for several minutes. At 7, during a thunderstorm, a window in Baker Street rattled so violently Mrs. Hudson feared it would break. Harry, half asleep on the sofa, mumbled, "Stop!" into the cushion. The window became still. Sherlock did not sleep that night. He set up 3 instruments around the room, none of which registered anything useful except a faint electromagnetic fluctuation near Harry's scar. At dawn, he wrote the first true hypothesis in the file. Working theory. Subject is a focal point for an energy system outside known physics. Trigger correlated with emotional intensity and intent. Environmental response appears non-random. Scar acts as conductor, capacitor, or wound channel. Further evidence required. He closed the casebook and looked across the room. Harry had fallen asleep again, sprawled untidily with one sock half off, a child like any other except for the impossible things the world did when he wanted them badly enough. Sherlock's face, unreadable to most, changed by 1 degree. Watson saw it. "You're fond of him," Watson said quietly. Sherlock continued staring at the file. "Fond is imprecise. Try it anyway." Sherlock was silent long enough that Watson assumed he would refuse. Then, at last, "He is," Sherlock said, "the most interesting thing that has ever happened to me." Watson smiled into his tea. "That'll do." Years passed in the peculiar order Baker Street preferred. Harry grew. He grew into sharp elbows and quick hands, into a restless mind, into eyes that missed very little and forgot almost nothing. He learned violin scales badly and chemistry safety reasonably well. He burned his eyebrow in an experiment at 8 and was forbidden from touching a Bunsen burner for 3 weeks, which he considered tyrannical. He could identify 10 cigar brands by ash residue by the age of 9 and spot a forged signature by the hesitation marks in the pen stroke by 10. He accompanied Sherlock on selected cases once he was old enough to keep quiet when required and intelligent enough not to romanticize danger. Sherlock never took him where violence was probable, but he did take him to interviews, libraries, court archives, shipping offices, and, once memorably, a butcher's shop to teach him how much a knife wound revealed about its wielder. Harry did not flinch. Not because he was hard, not in the ugly way people meant it. He simply had no patience for pretending facts became less real if you refused to look at them. That, more than anything, made him Sherlock's son in every way that mattered, though neither of them used the word. There was affection in 221b, but it spoke different dialects. Mrs. Hudson's affection arrived as extra blankets, scoldings, polished shoes, and hot meals waiting when cases ran long. Watson's affection arrived as a hand to the shoulder, a calm voice on difficult evenings, a steady refusal to let Harry become all intellect and no heart. Sherlock's affection arrived as inclusion, as explanations not simplified, as questions asked seriously and answers expected in full, as a seat in the armchair by the fire because Harry was always there anyway, as a chemistry set made child safe by Mrs. Hudson and then steadily made less safe by Sherlock. Once Harry proved he understood the difference between caution and fear. When Harry was 9, he woke from a nightmare and went downstairs expecting the dark. Instead, he found Sherlock still awake in his chair, violin across his lap, the room lit by the low amber of the banked fire. Sherlock looked up once. "Bad dream," Harry hesitated, then nodded. Sherlock considered this with the same seriousness he afforded ballistic evidence. "Tea is inappropriate at your age and brandy immoral, therefore the options are conversation or violin." "Conversation," Harry said, climbing into his armchair. Sherlock set the violin aside. "What was it?" Harry looked at the fire. "Green light," he said quietly, "and someone laughing." Sherlock went very still. Harry had strange dreams sometimes, not often, but often enough that Sherlock tracked them. Flashes, impressions, emotions without context, heat, falling, sometimes a woman screaming. Sometimes nothing but a sense of terrible distance and a voice full of hatred. Sherlock had never told him what the letter said in full. Not yet. Evidence-based disclosure. The boy deserved truth, but not before the truth could be anchored properly, so Sherlock asked, "Do you remember anything else?" Harry frowned. "No, just that it felt angry, like something trying to come through a locked door." Sherlock's gaze shifted briefly to the scar, then back to Harry. "Dreams," he said, "are sometimes memory misfiled, sometimes imagination, sometimes both. The useful question is not whether they frighten you, it's whether they tell you anything." Harry considered that. "Not yet." "Then we wait for more data." It was an absurdly Sherlockian answer. It helped anyway. Harry fell asleep in the chair an hour later, wrapped in a blanket Mrs. Hudson found draped over him at dawn, with Sherlock still awake beside the dying fire. The letters arrived on a Tuesday. The first one came through the letterbox with ordinary post and landed on the hall rug at precisely 8:13 in the morning. Mrs. Hudson picked it up on her way to the kitchen, glanced at the address, and frowned. "Mr. H. Potter," she read aloud. "The front bedroom, 221B Baker Street, London." Harry, halfway through toast, looked up. Sherlock extended a hand. Mrs. Hudson passed it over. The envelope was thick, yellowed, and addressed in emerald green ink of a quality Sherlock did not recognize. No postage stamp. No postmark. Sealed with red wax impressed with a crest. "Curious," Sherlock murmured. He slit it open with a butter knife and unfolded the parchment inside. His eyes moved once across the page, then again more slowly. Then he set the letter beside his plate and resumed his tea. Mrs. Hudson narrowed her eyes. "Well, Harry," Sherlock said, "you appear to have been invited to an institution called Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry." The room went completely still. Watson, who had stopped by for breakfast, lowered his cup. "Ah," he said, "so they've finally begun." Harry stared. "Witchcraft?" "Wizardry also," Sherlock said. "The curriculum appears broad." Mrs. Hudson sat down. "You're telling me," she said very carefully, "that the strange things this child has been doing for years are because he's a wizard." "Not conclusively," said Sherlock, "but the probability has risen sharply." Harry reached for the letter with steady fingers that were only slightly less calm than his face. He read it once, Then again, his expression passed through surprise, fascination, and something deeper, something like recognition. "As in magic," he said. "Yes." Harry looked up. "Real magic?" Sherlock spread his hands. Flying motorbikes were rather a clue. Harry let out a single astonished laugh. It lasted only a second before thought overtook emotion. "Can I go?" Sherlock regarded him over steepled fingers. "Almost certainly. Whether you should go is a separate question. Institutions are rarely improved by the mere fact of being old, secret, or impressed with themselves. We shall need to determine whether this Hogwarts educates or indoctrinates, whether its methods are coherent, and whether its staff are competent." Harry's eyes lit in the way they always did when the world became a puzzle. "We investigate." "Exactly." By noon, 12 more letters had arrived. One slid under the door while Mrs. Hudson was standing on the mat. 2 came down the chimney and startled the cat next door. Another appeared on the sitting-room mantel without any visible point of entry whatsoever. By 2 in the afternoon, Baker Street looked less like a residence and more like an administrative ambush. Sherlock sorted the envelopes into neat stacks. Harry compared ink composition between samples. Watson watched the proceedings with open amusement. At 3, a tawny owl flew straight through the open window, dropped a letter into Sherlock's lap, stole a sausage, and departed before Mrs. Hudson could protest. Sherlock sniffed the parchment. "Interesting resin trace. Not English. Possibly imported." Harry grinned. "You're enjoying this." "I am enjoying," Sherlock said, "the existence of a hidden system arrogant enough to assume it need not explain itself." By the time the sun had gone down, Sherlock had opened 1 letter, preserved 9 as controls, weighed 4, tested the ink on 2, and concluded the paper itself did not correspond to any commercial manufacturer he knew. "Everything about this is real," he said at last, looking at Harry across the cluttered table, "which leaves us only the more important question." "Whether they deserve me," Harry said. Sherlock's mouth moved a fraction. On anyone else it would have been called a smile, quite. That evening, after Mrs. Hudson had gone to bed and Watson had taken his leave, Sherlock sat with Harry in the lamplight and at last handed over the original letter from 11 years earlier. Harry read it in silence. His face changed slowly as the pieces aligned. Parents, their deaths. The reason no one at Baker Street spoke of before. The reason Sherlock sometimes looked at the scar like it was a cipher carved into bone. When he finished, he folded the paper carefully. "So they left me there," he said. "Yes." "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" Sherlock answered honestly. "Because partial truths are dangerous and I lacked the rest. You deserved context, not myth." Harry absorbed that then. "Do you think this Dumbledore man meant well?" Sherlock considered. "Possibly. Intent and judgment are not identical." Harry nodded once. "He looked older in that moment than 11. Then we find out." Sherlock leaned back in his chair, studying him. Here at last was the hinge upon which the case had always rested. The child on the doorstep, the anomalies, the hidden world, the school. And Harry steady, sharp, curious Harry meeting it all not with fear but with the clean instinct to examine. Sherlock felt the old internal click again. "Yes," he said softly. "We do." He crossed the room, opened the drawer of his desk, and withdrew a small leather notebook bound in dark blue. Harry recognized it immediately. It was one of Sherlock's field notebooks, not new, carefully chosen, the pages unmarked. "For observations," Sherlock said, placing it on the table between them. "Date everything. Separate inference from fact. Trust nothing merely because it is traditional, celebrated, or spoken by someone with a beard. Particularly a beard." Harry took the notebook reverently. "And one more thing," Sherlock added. He went to the shelf, reached behind a row of journals, and produced a compact metal instrument in a fitted case. Harry's eyes widened. "The portable spectrometer?" "The smaller one. You may take it to school under the understanding that you will not allow it to be confiscated by fools. If magical society has laws against scientific curiosity, so much the worse for magical society." Harry laughed again, this time with genuine delight. He opened the notebook to the first page and, after only a brief pause, wrote, "Case file, Hogwarts, subject, magic, objective. Learn how it works." Sherlock watched the pen move. Then he looked at the boy, at the quick mind, the calm hands, the scar that had once marked a crime scene and had become, somehow, just one piece of Harry rather than the whole of him. Most people, Sherlock reflected, mistook care for softness. They thought love, to be real, had to be sentimental. But sentiment was not the only form devotion could take. Sometimes devotion was attention, sometimes it was rigor. Sometimes it was refusing to let a child grow up small because the world expected him to fit inside a story someone else had written. Harry looked up from the page. "What now?" Sherlock moved back to his chair and steepled his fingers. "Now," he said, "we prepare for the possibility that an entire civilization of wizards has never had its assumptions properly challenged." Outside, London rain tapped softly at the windows of Baker Street. Inside, under lamplight and the smell of old paper and chemicals and tea, the first real chapter of Harry Potter's life began. And somewhere far away, in a castle that had stood too long without being thoroughly questioned, a place was waiting for a boy who had been taught from infancy that mystery was not something to worship. It was something to solve. Chapter 2. Hogwarts as a crime scene. The morning Harry Potter left Baker Street, London seemed determined to pretend it was an ordinary day. The traffic was its usual impatient self. Newspaper boys shouted headlines no one would remember in 48 hours. The sky was the color of wet slate. A bus hissed at the curb, and a woman in a navy coat argued with a florist over the price of white roses. The city performed normality with its usual confidence. Harry stood on the pavement outside 221B with a trunk at his feet, an owl cage in one hand, and a notebook in the pocket of his coat. Mrs. Hudson fussed over his scarf, as though he were being sent to sea in winter, rather than to a boarding school in Scotland. Watson had arrived early and, after a short and unsuccessful attempt to behave like a sensible adult, had given Harry an extra fountain pen and then spent 10 minutes warning him not to skip meals when he was thinking. Sherlock, by contrast, had offered exactly one final instruction before they left. Observe first. Conclude later. Reverse that order and you become everyone else. Harry had nodded. He was already smiling, not broadly. Harry rarely did anything broadly. But there was a brightness in him that morning, an alertness sharpened into excitement that made him look younger and older at once. He was going to a castle full of magic. More importantly, he was going to investigate it. The entrance to platform 9 3/4 turned out to be hidden in a way Harry found immediately interesting, not because it was impossible. By now, impossible had downgraded itself in his mind from existential category to data type. What interested him was the psychological elegance of the concealment. A barrier hidden in plain sight at a crowded station. A threshold no one ordinary noticed because everyone ordinary had been trained to avert their eyes from the slightly strange, provided it moved with confidence. They rely on expectation, Harry murmured, watching a family of redheads pass directly through the barrier between platforms 9 and 10. Sherlock's gaze followed his. Most systems do. Do you think it's enchantment or behavior? Almost certainly both. Good concealment is never just one thing. Mrs. Hudson clucked. The good concealment in question had better not get my Harry flattened by a train. Watson smiled. He'll manage. Harry took hold of the trolley. For a brief instant, he wondered not whether it would work, but whether crossing it would feel different. A threshold should feel like something. There should be pressure distortion, a shift in temperature or sound. Instead, there was only the slightest sensation of passing through cool silk, and then noise, steam, color. An enormous scarlet engine breathing white clouds into the air while witches and wizards moved in every direction with trunks, pets, cloaks, laughter, impatience, worry, and the loose disorder of 100 separate journeys converging on one timetable. Harry stopped. Not in awe, exactly. Awe was too passive. He stopped because there was too much information, children saying goodbye to parents. Different wand woods visible in back pockets and sleeves, robes of varying quality. Owl cages from at least 4 different manufacturers. A man selling sweets whose cart had been charmed to hover a quarter-inch off the ground, inefficient, but dramatic. Spells in casual use. Birds navigating through steam as though it parted for them. A station existing beside an ordinary station, yet psychologically invisible to the non-magical world. Interesting? Sherlock asked. Harry's eyes were moving rapidly. Very. Sherlock inclined his head once, the nearest thing he offered to affection in public. Mrs. Hudson hugged Harry next, hard enough to make him laugh despite himself. Watson followed, with a hand briefly on the back of Harry's neck and an expression composed equally of pride and concern. Sherlock waited until last. For a second Harry thought he might merely shake hands. That would have been like him. Precise. Formal, perfectly sincere. Instead, Sherlock adjusted the fall of Harry's collar, as though correcting some defect in symmetry only he could see. "Write weekly," he said. "I will. Do not let incompetent men intimidate you with titles." "I won't. And if anything about the place suggests either danger or systemic stupidity, document it." Harry's mouth twitched. "Those seem likely to overlap." "They usually do." For a moment they stood there, eye to eye, then Sherlock stepped back. "Go on, then." Harry took the trunk and boarded the train. He looked back once from the doorway. Mrs. Hudson waved with a handkerchief. Watson lifted 2 fingers in salute. Sherlock merely stood still in the steam, coat dark against the platform, face unreadable to everyone except Harry. Harry knew what it meant. It meant learn everything. The train gave a whistle and began to move. The Hogwarts Express, Harry discovered within the first 15 minutes, was an excellent environment for field study. He found an empty compartment and set his trunk away neatly, before sitting by the window with the small spectrometer case under the seat and his notebook open across one knee. The countryside unfurled itself in shifting bands of soot-dark suburbs, warehouses, field lines, and later the long green distances that marked their gradual movement north. He logged weather. Track vibrations. The approximate ratio of magical to non-magical families on board, based on pre-departure observations at the station. He wrote down the train's interior details as well. The charm work maintaining temperature, the age of the compartment fittings, the faint scent of polish overlaid with old smoke and parchment. Then, because Sherlock had trained him to use travel time profitably, he began reading the landscape. 3 fields beyond a viaduct, he noted fresh soil discoloration where something large had burned recently. 2 symmetrical for ordinary farm fire. 1 ruined cottage near a tree line displayed blackening at the windows without structural collapse, suggesting either very targeted combustion or a non-physical heat source. Near the Scottish border, cloud movement altered abruptly over a patch of distant moor as though interacting with an unseen vertical boundary. Magic left traces, not obvious traces, not to most eyes. But then, most eyes were lazy. The compartment door slid open. The girl standing there had brown hair already escaping its attempts at order, 4 books in her arms, and the expression of someone who had entered not because she needed a seat, but because she had decided the person inside might be worth evaluating. "Everywhere else is full," she said, though Harry thought this was only partly true. "May I sit here?" "Of course." She sat opposite him, arranging the books with the efficiency of a person who believed surfaces existed to be used. Before Harry could return to his notes, her gaze had already moved from his face to the notebook, then to the landscape beyond his shoulder, then back. "You're not daydreaming," she said. "You're tracking." Harry looked at her more carefully. "Yes." "Why? Because most people waste windows?" That made the corner of her mouth move. "Fair answer." She shifted a book aside and held out her hand. "Hermione Granger, Harry Potter." Hermione's expression altered by a very small degree. Recognition, yes, but not celebrity-struck recognition. More the quick mental filing of a fact already read about, now confirmed in person. "I wondered if I'd meet you," she said. "People have been talking." "About what?" "The usual things people talk about when they know very little and feel strongly anyway." Harry considered that and approved of her immediately. "You've read ahead," he said, nodding toward her books. "I've read all the set texts," Hermione corrected. "And several additional ones because the set texts seemed alarmingly content with broad claims unsupported by mechanism." Harry stared. Then he reached into his coat, produced the blue notebook Sherlock had given him, turned it around, and showed her the words on the first-page case file. Hogwarts, subject, magic, objective, learn how it works. Hermione looked at the page, then at Harry, and for the first time all morning genuinely smiled. "Oh," she said. "Good." The next hour passed with such speed that neither of them noticed the trolley arrive until the witch pushing it had already cleared her throat twice. They had moved quickly past names and first impressions into substance. Harry outlined the hypothesis Sherlock had formed over years at Baker Street. That what wizards called magic was likely not chaos or miracle, but an energy system governed by laws not yet adequately mapped, interacting with cognition, intention, and possibly biological traits. Hermione responded by pulling out her own notebook and listing every magical claim she had encountered in her reading that seemed either self-contradictory or suspiciously vague. "Wand movement instructions," she said, flipping to a page dense with cramped notes, "are described as if the motion itself produces the effect, but that's absurd. A wand motion can't be causative in isolation. At most it channels or encodes intent." "Agreed," Harry said. "And half the textbooks describe incantations as if pronunciation creates magic, while the other half imply silent casting is superior. So language may be a training scaffold rather than a necessary input." Hermione's eyes lit. "Exactly. And none of them," Harry went on, "define what magical exhaustion actually is. Is it caloric depletion? Neural fatigue? Something like muscle fatigue in a separate system?" Hermione flipped pages rapidly. "There's one mention in a beginner's guide to practical magic about overexertion causing faintness, nosebleeds, and reduced control, which sounds physiological, but they don't quantify anything." "They quantify nothing," Harry said. "It's all sufficient power and proper concentration, as though those are measurements." Hermione leaned back, folded her arms, and looked deeply offended on behalf of science itself. "That is precisely the problem. They bought sweets only when the trolley which stood there waiting, and Hermione, after a moment's internal debate, decided nutritional neglect would be counterproductive. The door opened once more some time later to admit a red-haired boy with a face full of uncertainty and a toadless round-faced boy behind him. "Have either of you seen a toad?" the round-faced boy asked miserably. "I've lost mine." Harry had not. Hermione immediately stood up to help search, because that was the sort of person she was even before anyone else had quite noticed. The red-haired boy remained in the doorway after they left, glancing from Harry to the stack of books, to the notes, then back. "Is this seat taken?" "No." He sat. For 30 seconds, silence, then, "I'm Ron Weasley, Harry Potter." Ron nearly inhaled a chocolate frog whole. Harry had seen that reaction before in smaller forms. He waited it out patiently. "You really are, then," Ron managed. "Blimey. That appears to be the consensus." Ron stared for another second, then, to Harry's relief, seemed to decide that continuing to stare would be ridiculous. "I'm not supposed to ask about the scar," he said. "That's considerate." "So, what are you writing?" Harry turned the notebook slightly. Ron read the heading. His brow furrowed. "Hogwarts is a case file? Potentially." Ron looked utterly baffled. "Why?" Harry considered how best to phrase it. "Because it's an ancient institution full of secrets, hidden rules, unexplained hazards, and authority figures who appear to expect trust before providing evidence." "That's almost the definition of a case." Ron stared at him. Then, unexpectedly, he laughed. "You're mad," he said. "Possibly." Ron shoved a handful of Bertie Bott's every flavor beans into his mouth. "You'll fit in fine, then." By the time Hermione returned without the toad, but with 3 additional observations about train corridor traffic patterns, an odd little alliance had begun to settle into place. Hermione brought rigor. Ron brought native context and the priceless capacity to say, "That's weird even for magic." When necessary, Harry brought method. The combination worked at once. The first sight of Hogwarts arrived at dusk. It rose out of the darkening landscape with all the theatrical intelligence of a thing designed to overwhelm. Towers, windows lit gold against the deep blue of evening, stone reflected in black water. A castle large enough to imply permanence and old enough to imply authority, whether it deserved it or not. Harry stepped out of the boat with his eyes narrowed, not in skepticism but in concentration. The enchanted effect was undeniable. The place had presence. It had also, he suspected, been built or modified over centuries by people who considered impressive a structural principle. He wanted floor plans immediately. The entrance hall swallowed sound and redistributed it. Torch flames burned without smoke. The stone underfoot held warmth inconsistent with the outside temperature. Portrait eyes tracked the students with a realism too precise to be mere animation. A ghost drifted through a wall 10 feet away, lowering ambient temperature by a measurable degree as it passed. Harry wrote all 3 things down before Professor McGonagall had finished explaining the sorting. "You're not amazed," said a voice near his elbow. Harry turned. Ron, standing beside him in the line, was looking at the ceiling, the torches, the ghosts, then back at Harry with increasing suspicion. "I am," Harry said honestly. "I'm just distributing it differently." Ron blinked. "What does that mean?" "It means the floating candles are impressive but not urgent. The ghost lowering room temperature without obvious energy exchange is urgent. So are the moving portraits and the lack of smoke from the torches. The castle is violating at least 3 ordinary physical assumptions before dinner." Ron processed that. "Right," he said at last. "You are definitely mad." Hermione, overhearing, murmured, "He's methodical." Ron glanced between them. "You're both mad." Professor McGonagall gave the sorting explanation crisply, with all the efficient severity of a woman who would have run a military campaign perfectly if given sufficient tea. Harry liked her at once. Not because she was kind, though he suspected she could be in private, but because she was exact. She wasted neither words nor authority. Then the doors opened, and the great hall revealed itself. Even Harry, who had spent the last 12 hours resisting awe on principle, stopped dead for a fraction of a second. The ceiling mirrored the sky so perfectly that he could not at first determine whether it was an illusion or a structural transparency effect. The floating candles cast light without visible support. The longhouse tables formed lines of organized allegiance. At the far end, the staff table elevated authority physically, symbolically, and strategically. A school, yes, also a stage. It was built to produce belonging, aspiration, intimidation, and obedience all at once. That was not inherently sinister. Good institutions used atmosphere too, but atmosphere was never neutral. Harry logged the thought mentally and followed the line forward. When the sorting hat was placed on his head, he was prepared for many things. He was not prepared for another mind. "Ah," said a voice inside the dark beneath the brim. "Well, that is unusual." Harry sat very still. "You're sentient to a functional degree, and you've been taught to distinguish degrees." "Lovely." The hat's presence moved through his thoughts not with intrusion exactly, but with extraordinary access. Harry could feel it touching memories lightly, turning them in the light like pieces of evidence. Structured mind, very structured, trained observation, high pattern tolerance. Instinctive distrust of unsupported claims. "Ah, and there's the detective. My guardian," Harry said, "so I see. What an influence. Very uncommon in an 11-year-old. You don't think like a child. That seems unkind to children." The hat gave the distinct impression of amusement. "No, only accurate." "Let's see." "There is courage here, certainly, but not theatrical courage, calculated courage. The kind that asks first whether a danger is real and only then whether it can be survived. Intelligence in abundance, but more importantly, discipline. You don't admire cleverness for its own sake. You demand utility. That will irritate half your teachers, only half optimistic." Harry waited. The hat seemed to be considering genuine alternatives. He could feel possibilities opening and shutting. Slytherin would value your strategic mind. You do very well there. Ravenclaw would feed your curiosity, though you may drive them to distraction by asking for definitions. Gryffindor would admire the fearlessness that comes from preparation. HM, you're making this sound less like destiny and more like classification error, a refreshing description. There was another pause. Then the hat settled, decisively. Ravenclaw, applause broke over him as the hat was lifted away. Harry stood, adjusted his glasses automatically, and went to the table where blue and bronze students were clapping with expressions ranging from welcome to intense curiosity. He sat between a dreamy-looking girl staring at the ceiling as if listening to something no one else could hear, and a thin boy already eyeing the contents of Harry's notebook. Across the hall, Hermione was sorted into Gryffindor. Harry's eyebrows rose. Hermione, marching toward the red and gold table with the air of someone who had judged the hat and found its reasoning acceptable, caught his eye across the room and gave the smallest shrug. Interesting. Ron followed her there moments later, looking relieved. Then dinner arrived in a flood of silver platters and conversation. Harry spent the meal eating enough to satisfy Watson's ghostly supervision while studying the staff table. Dumbledore was unmistakable. The beard from the letter. The eyes of a man perpetually thinking 3 moves ahead and uncertain whether that excused him. Beside him, Professor McGonagall maintained alert posture even while seated. A large, broad man Harry identified at once as the groundskeeper from Sherlock's description. Hagrid sat farther down with the unmistakable weight distribution of a man who treated physical danger as weather. And then there was Quirrell. The defense against the dark arts professor looked, at first glance, like anxiety with a beard attached. Thin, tremulous, wrapped in a purple turban. His eyes darted. His hands worried the edge of his goblet. He radiated nervousness so visibly that most students would accept it at once as the entire truth. Harry did not. There was something off in the rhythm of it, the stammer that appeared in one exchange and vanished in the next. The way his gaze, when he thought no one watched, moved with abrupt cold precision utterly at odds with the performance of fluster. Harry wrote a single line in the margin of his dinner notes. Quirrell, likely not what he appears. Observe. He underlined it once. Ravenclaw Tower required a riddle to enter. Harry approved immediately. Not because riddles were practical security, most riddles were vulnerable to persistence, group effort, and guessing, but because any institution that filtered entry by thought rather than a password had at least one redeeming principle. His dormitory was circular, high-windowed, and full of blue hangings silvered by moonlight. He unpacked methodically, placing books by subject, clothes by type, instrument case under the bed, notebook on the bedside table. Then he lay awake for another hour listening. Ancient castles spoke, pipes, distant steps, wind through stone seams, murmuring portraits. Once very late, a sound like rock shifting somewhere deep within the structure and then settling again. Hogwarts was not asleep. It merely had its eyes closed. Harry smiled into the dark. He had never been happier. The first week established 2 things beyond argument. First, Hogwarts was intellectually underdescribed by its own literature. Second, Hermione Granger was going to become indispensable whether the school was ready for that or not. They found each other in the library on the 2nd afternoon of term, not by arrangement, simply by the sort of inevitability produced when 2 minds are irritated by the same omissions. Hermione already had 6 books spread around her, all on introductory magical theory. Harry arrived with 3 texts on wand lore, 1 on transfiguration, and a look that told her instantly he had discovered something infuriating. "They use the word channel," he said without preamble, dropping into the chair opposite her. "Repeatedly, the wand channels magic. Channels what? From where, at what loss rate, under what constraints?" Hermione pushed one of her books toward him. "Read the chapter on magical cores." Harry skimmed 3 paragraphs and made a face. "This is mysticism wearing academic robes." "Yes," Hermione said grimly, "that was my conclusion as well." So began the real work, They created categories, observed phenomena, common claims, unsupported traditions, questions requiring experiment. Ron, when he eventually found them buried in texts and notes, looked at the parchment headings and groaned. "You've made homework on purpose." "We've made methodology," Hermione corrected. "That is worse." Yet he stayed, which turned out to be useful because Ron possessed something Harry and Hermione did not: lived familiarity with magical assumptions. He knew what wizarding people took for granted, which made him a remarkably good detector for invisible cultural nonsense. "Wands choose the wizard," Ron said around a mouthful of sandwich on Thursday evening after Harry explained his theory that the wand was a focusing amplifier rather than a source. "Everybody knows that." Harry looked up from his notes. "How?" Ron blinked. "What do you mean, how? How do they choose? By what process? On what basis? Response to magical signature, temperament, handedness, intent structure. Why do some woods prefer some users? Why does any of it work?" Ron opened his mouth, closed it, then pointed accusingly at Hermione. "He's infectious." "He's correct," Hermione said. Ron slumped. "I liked it better when magic was magic." "It still is," Harry said. "That's just not the same as unknowable." The classes deepened the pattern. Charms was promising. Professor Flitwick cared about precision, which Harry respected. Herbology was more systematized than the textbooks suggested, though still guilty of naming effects without defining causes. History of magic was a catastrophe of wasted opportunity taught by a ghost who had mistaken chronology for thought. Transfiguration, however, seized Harry's full attention almost at once. McGonagall transformed her desk into a pig and back again on the first day, and while the rest of the class reacted with open wonder, Harry's mind moved straight to the implications. Matter altered, yet conserved in apparent continuity, not illusion, not overlay. Structural transformation of a real object into another real object with memory of original state retained sufficiently for reversal. He filled 6 pages before the lesson ended. When McGonagall set them a matchstick to needle exercise, Harry tried not once but 12 times, each with slightly varied concentration and wand angle, tracking outcome quality against internal sensation. On the 13th attempt, the match became a needle so fine and sharp that it reflected light differently from the others. McGonagall paused beside his desk. "Mr. Potter," she said. "Yes, Professor?" "Why?" asked McGonagall, looking at the 3 columns of notes beside his work. "Have you produced what appears to be a laboratory record for a first-year exercise?" Harry looked down. "Because without one, I can't isolate which input changed the result." There was a beat of silence. Then, very faintly, one corner of McGonagall's mouth shifted. "5 points to Ravenclaw," she said. "Though you may in future confine yourself to 10 trials where 12 are not strictly required." "Yes, Professor." When she moved on, the boy next to Harry whispered, "Are you trying to get adopted by the library?" Harry whispered back, "Potentially." Potions was different. Potions was not merely interesting. Potions was dangerous in the proper scientific way. Heat, volatile compounds, consequences for inattention. Harry liked it immediately. Professor Snape entered the dungeon like a man who had rehearsed contempt until it became part of his breathing. His black robes moved sharply. His gaze swept the class and found Harry within seconds. There was a pause there. A loaded pause, not surprise, recognition plus prejudice. Harry filed it. Then Snape began speaking and the room changed. Because beneath the unpleasantness, beneath the obvious preference for intimidation as a teaching method, there was intelligence. Dense, exacting, disciplined intelligence. When Snape described potion-making as subtle science and exact art, Harry believed him. The language shifted in his mouth when he spoke of ingredients, timing, interaction. This was not theater. This was mastery. It made his cruelty less forgivable, not more, but it made him worth studying. Then came the question. "Potter," Snape said, voice like silk over a blade. "What would I get if I added powdered root of asphodel to an infusion of wormwood?" Harry had read the text. More importantly, he had read 3 supplementary references and spent part of the previous evening diagramming possible commonalities among soporific potions. "The draught of living death, sir," he said. "Though the name is imprecise if the subject remains biologically reversible, I'd assume the compound acts metabolically rather than destructively, which would require a very different antidote from a true poison." The dungeon went silent. Snape's black eyes fixed on him with an expression no one else in the room could read. "What?" Snape said softly. "Would I find in a bezoar?" Harry answered. "Then monkshood and wolfsbane." Then an additional question Snape had not intended to ask, because Harry used the pause to inquire whether standardized antidote classifications existed, or whether potion makers relied on apprenticeship tradition to compensate for taxonomic laziness. Hermione made a noise halfway between alarm and admiration. Ron later described it as watching someone throw a lit match into an oil drum just to see what happened. Snape's mouth tightened, but he did answer. "Phosphorus-based restoration is the accepted reversal method," he said at last, in response to Harry's first observation. "And if you insist on interrogating terminology in your first week, Potter, do so while stirring. 10 points to Ravenclaw." There was an audible intake of breath across the room. Harry lowered his eyes to the cauldron to hide his surprise. Snape moved on like a storm front. Hermione, 2 seats away, wrote frantically for the rest of the lesson. At lunch, she cornered Harry before he could sit down. "You argued with him." I asked a clarifying question. "You asked 3. They were related." Hermione looked delighted. He answered, "Yes. Do you know what that means?" Harry took a sip of pumpkin juice. "That he likes precision more than he dislikes me." Hermione stared, then nodded slowly. "I think that may actually be true." Across the hall, Snape happened to glance up at that exact moment. His expression suggested he regretted everything. By the end of September, Harry had built preliminary hypotheses about 4 major areas of magic. 1. The wand was a focusing instrument, not a generator, likely responsive to some interaction between magical signature, cognition, and material resonance. 2. Transfiguration required energy input from the caster, meaning so-called magical exhaustion probably had a physiological basis and could perhaps be measured through pulse, blood sugar, or other biomarkers. 3. Charms appeared to encode desired outcomes through a combination of intent, movement, and verbal architecture, with the incantation perhaps serving as a cognitive stabilizer. 4. Hogwarts itself was less a building than an ecosystem of layered magical systems accumulated over centuries, some of which even the staff probably no longer fully understood. This last conclusion was supported by the staircases. They moved, not always. Not randomly either. The pattern was too complex for randomness, but too irregular for simple scheduling. Harry began tracking their behavior between lessons, mapping destinations against time of day, student traffic, and observed mood of the castle if such a term could be used without embarrassment. Hermione contributed corridor patterns. Ron contributed the useful fact that sometimes the stairs just do that was considered an acceptable explanation by most people, which made Harry want to lie down on the floor and stare at the ceiling. "What?" Ron demanded. "That sentence," Harry said, "is why civilizations collapse." Ron threw a bread roll at him. They were, Harry realized with faint surprise, friends, not merely allies of convenience, not just intellectually compatible. Friends. The recognition came quietly one evening in the library when Hermione fell asleep over 1,000 magical herbs, and Fungi and Ron, instead of mocking her, took off his jumper and draped it over her shoulders before either of them noticed Harry watching. Harry looked back down at his notes very quickly. Something warm and unfamiliar moved through his chest, not dramatic, not overwhelming. Just the simple certainty that he was no longer alone in the work. At Baker Street, solitude had never frightened him. Here, companionship altered the shape of thought itself. Useful, he wrote later in his notebook. Then, after a pause, he added, also good. Quirrell continued to trouble him. The first anomaly was auditory. Stammers had patterns. Harry knew this because Sherlock had once spent an entire Sunday teaching him the difference between neurological impairment, fear response, habitual hesitancy, and performed weakness in witness testimony. Real stammers did not vanish cleanly in moments of distraction. Quirrell's did. On September 3rd, Harry heard him in the corridor disputing with Filch over a classroom key. The argument became heated. Quirrell, focused and irritated, spoke 3 entire sentences without a stammer. In class an hour later, the stammer returned so forcefully it broke words in half. Harry wrote it down. On September 6th, Quirrell dropped a stack of books outside the staff room. McGonagall bent to help him. For one sharp instant, as Quirrell muttered thanks, his voice was low, smooth, and entirely untroubled by fear. Then 2 students turned the corner and the stammer snapped back into place like a mask hastily resumed. Harry wrote that down too. The second anomaly was visual, the turban. Harry knew enough from Baker Street to be wary of drawing conclusions from unfamiliar cultural dress. He consulted a book, then another, then asked quietly in the library whether standard wizarding head coverings carried ritual significance. None of the answers quite fit. Quirrell wore the turban too constantly and too tightly. It was not decorative and did not sit like a personal preference. It wrapped the back of his head with unusual insistence. Even in warmth, even at meals, even in situations where most men relaxed clothing without thinking, it remained fixed. Concealment, not style. The third anomaly was olfactory. Passing Quirrell in the corridor one afternoon, Harry caught a scent beneath garlic and stale fabric that he couldn't immediately place. Not rot, not illness. Something metallic, faintly acrid and strangely dry, as though a room had once burned and then been shut for years. That night he wrote, Quirrell, disguise probable. Question, what is being concealed and from whom? He stared at the line a while before closing the notebook. Then he looked up at the dark shape of Ravenclaw Tower beyond the dormitory window and smiled. Sherlock had been right. Hogwarts was real. It was magical. It was extraordinary, and it was absolutely full of evidence. The first month ended with rain against the castle windows, and Harry seated at a table in the library between Hermione and Ron. 3 books open, notes everywhere, dinner forgotten on a tray beside them. Hermione was cross-referencing Wand Woods. Ron was trying to understand why anyone would voluntarily read 3 extra chapters on goblin metallurgy. Harry was building a list titled Institutional Mysteries requiring further investigation. Hermione glanced over and read the entries upside down. Only 7. I'm consolidating. Ron leaned across. You've put why is a dangerous corridor guarded by a giant 3-headed dog in a school as number 1. It's the most urgent. Shouldn't number 1 be how does broom flight work? No, Harry and Hermione said together. Ron sighed. I need more academically irresponsible friends. Harry dipped his pen again. Outside, thunder rolled over the mountains. Inside, somewhere in the depths of the castle, stone shifted like a giant settling in its sleep. Harry paused, listening. Then he wrote one final note at the bottom of the page. General assessment. Hogwarts is less a school with secrets than a secret with classrooms attached. Continue investigation. He closed the notebook. Across the table, Hermione yawned and rubbed her eyes. Ron muttered something about starving to death among books. Harry looked at both of them, at the scattered pages and candlelight and impossible castle, and the case unfolding around them, and felt the clear, focused thrill that always came at the start of something difficult and worthwhile. This, he thought, was going to be interesting, very interesting. Chapter 3. The Quirrell Gambit. By the second week of October, Harry Potter had reached a conclusion Sherlock Holmes would have described as both obvious and insufficient. Professor Quirrell was lying. The problem, as Sherlock had also spent years teaching him, was that lying was rarely the final answer to anything worth knowing. It was only the doorway. A man lied for a reason. To conceal fear, ambition, guilt, coercion, allegiance, weakness, desire, debt, or some untidy combination of all 7. One did not solve a case by noting deception. One solved it by determining what shape the truth had to take in order for the deception to be useful. Harry had observed Quirrell for nearly 5 weeks. He had enough now to say, with confidence, that the stammer was at least partly performed, the nervousness was selective, and the turban concealed something beyond simple vanity. He also had enough experience of Hogwarts to know that saying any of that aloud to the wrong person would get him one of 3 responses: dismissal, scandalized overreaction, or a vague insistence that Professor Quirrell has had a difficult year, which amounted to the same thing. So he did what Sherlock would have done. He opened a case file. The title went neatly across the first page of a fresh section in his notebook: Case File. Q. Subject: Professor Quirinus Quirrell. Initial question: what is he hiding and why? Below that, Harry added the first rule of the investigation: no theory to be accepted without at least 3 independent lines of support. Then he began. The first line of inquiry was behavioral. Harry positioned himself, over the next several days, in places where observation could occur without attracting suspicion. Near the end of corridors Quirrell used frequently, at tables within peripheral range during meals, and once behind a suit of armor outside the staff staircase, until he concluded the armor smelled unpleasant enough to compromise clear thought. Hermione helped from the library side, noting Quirrell's borrowing patterns whenever possible. Ron contributed after initial resistance by reporting the sorts of things only someone raised in wizarding society would think ordinary enough not to mention. His classroom always smells weird, Ron said over breakfast on a Wednesday. Harry looked up at once. Weird how? Ron shrugged. Garlic. Mold, sort of burned, maybe. Hermione paused halfway through buttering toast. Burned, Ron frowned. Maybe, I don't know, just odd. Harry made a note. Then, does he always wear the turban? Ron gave him the sort of look one reserved for questions so obvious they felt like traps. Yes. At all times, as far as I've seen. Have you ever seen him remove it? No. Hermione set down the butter knife with care. Actually, she said, now that you mention it, neither have I. Harry's pen moved again. At breakfast, Quirrell stammered heavily whenever addressed by other teachers. But Harry noted on October 12th that the stammer nearly vanished when Quirrell reprimanded a Hufflepuff for speaking out of turn during defense. Not entirely gone, Quirrell had too much practice for that, but significantly reduced. The same afternoon, Harry overheard him in the entrance hall speaking to Filch in a clipped, irritated tone so smooth that if Harry had not already been watching for it, he might have missed the incongruity. At dinner, the stammer returned with theatrical intensity when Dumbledore asked him whether the second years were adapting well to practical shielding exercises. Performance under scrutiny, minimal performance under irritation, moderate lapse under surprise. Harry underlined the pattern twice. Sherlock's lectures on witness psychology resurfaced almost word for word in his mind. Observe what breaks the mask. People are never more honest than when their attention is elsewhere. Quirrell's mask broke when he forgot he was wearing it. That was useful. What was more useful was who he appeared most careful around, not McGonagall, not Snape, not even Dumbledore, though Quirrell's manner around the headmaster carried a strain so taut it was nearly visible. No, Quirrell was most controlled around Harry. That, Harry thought, was harder to explain away. Several times, he caught the professor looking at him in class, not with the bland interest of a teacher monitoring a student, but with an intensity that vanished the moment Harry met it. Once, during a discussion of defensive wards, Harry answered a question about layered threshold enchantments, and Quirrell's fingers tightened so sharply on the desk edge that the knuckles blanched white beneath the skin. Fear, recognition, hatred, Harry could not tell yet. But the emotional charge was too strong to ignore, he wrote. Subject reacts disproportionately to me specifically. Why? That evening he sat cross-legged on his bed in Ravenclaw Tower, notebook open, and tried to order the possibilities. Possibility 1. Quirrell knew who Harry was in the ordinary public sense, and the attention was merely a byproduct of fame. Rejected. The look was too personal. Possibility 2. Quirrell harbored some old grudge against Harry's parents, possible but weak. Possibility 3. Quirrell was connected, directly or indirectly, to the events of the night Harry's parents died. Harry set down the pen. That was a bigger thought than the page deserved. He did not write it yet. Instead, he closed the notebook and went downstairs, where the common room fire was low, and a fourth year was snoring quietly behind a half-finished arithmancy chart. Harry sat in his usual armchair by the window and stared out into the dark grounds. He had learned at Baker Street that there were moments when thought must slow, or it ceased to be thought at all and became only reaction wearing logic's coat. This was one of those moments. He let the possibility exist without endorsing it. Then he filed it mentally under high significance/insufficient evidence and moved on. That, too, Sherlock had taught him. The second line of inquiry was physical. It began accidentally. On the 15th of October, Harry arrived early to defense against the dark arts because he wanted 5 uninterrupted minutes to examine the protective diagrams Quirrell had chalked on the board after the previous lesson. The classroom door stood ajar. No one was inside, or so Harry thought. He stepped in and instantly something was wrong. The room felt different, not colder exactly, though the air did seem thinner. Not darker, though the corners held shadow in an oddly deliberate way. It was more like walking into a space that had very recently contained great emotional force and had not yet settled afterward. Baker Street had felt like that once or twice after clients left in the wake of difficult truths. A room remembered intensity. Harry moved slowly. The chalk diagrams on the board were unchanged. The desks stood in straight rows. Quirrell's chair, pushed back from his desk, faced slightly toward the window. On the carved wooden arm of that chair was a dark reddish-brown smear. Harry crouched, not paint, not rust, too irregular. Too glossy where it had dried thinner, blood, but not human blood, at least not if Sherlock's old lessons on stain character were to be trusted. The viscosity pattern was wrong. Too oily at the edge. The color too layered in the center. Interesting, Harry did not touch it with his fingers. Instead, he took from his satchel a folded scrap of clean paper, lifted a minute flake from the edge of the stain, and slipped it into a labeled envelope just as footsteps approached in the corridor. He was back in his seat with his Transfiguration essay open by the time the rest of the class arrived. That night, he performed the simplest tests available in a first-year dormitory without alarming his roommates. He dissolved a microscopic sample in distilled water from his supply kit. The response was immediate and strange. The fluid separated almost at once into 2 tones, a thin amber residue and a deeper iridescent red that held light oddly, as though refracting more than its volume should allow. Harry added 1 drop of reagent from Sherlock's miniature travel chemistry case, a diluted oxidation marker they had once used on a warehouse fraud case in Whitecapel, and watched the color shift through green to gold. Not human. He compared the reaction to a reference list copied from one of Hermione's creature handbooks. His pulse quickened, dragon blood, or something close enough chemically to mimic several of its known signatures. Harry leaned back in his chair and stared at the vial. Dragon blood had many magical applications. That much the library had been happy to tell him in grand, unhelpful paragraphs. But it also appeared, according to a dry footnote in a more specialized text Hermione had unearthed, in certain residue patterns after high-energy dark magical casting due to overlapping alchemical markers. In other words, the presence of dragon blood signatures did not prove a dragon. It proved unusual magic, which made the smear on Quirrell's chair far more interesting than if it had merely been blood. Harry labeled the vial carefully and turned to a fresh page. Evidence B1, unknown residue on Quirrell's chair. Chemical behavior consistent with dragon blood markers /dark casting residue overlap. He paused, then added, question. Why would the back of Quirrell's chair carry magical discharge residue? The obvious answer arrived at once, because whatever was happening involved the back of Quirrell's head. Harry sat very still, the turban again. Always the turban. Something concealed there was not passive. It was active enough to leave traces on furniture that elevated the matter considerably. The third line of inquiry was structural. Hogwarts, for all its theatricality, had one great flaw common to most old institutions. It assumed mystery itself was a defense. It was not. Mystery deterred the obedient. It attracted the curious. Harry and Hermione had already spent part of September building an informal map of the castle's consistent routes, bottlenecks, unused passages, and semi-reliable staircase moods. They had also, with Ron's reluctant assistance, compiled a list titled Things Everyone Thinks Are Fine Which Are Not Fine, the third-floor corridor being item 1. Fluffy, the enormous three-headed dog guarding the trapdoor beyond the forbidden door, had transformed from spectacular oddity to active point of concern after Harry's first encounter with it. The security around the corridor was visibly layered. Not just the dog, but distinct magical signatures Harry could feel without yet naming them. Something valuable was being guarded there, something the staff considered important enough to protect and, inexplicably, safe enough to keep inside a school. The contradiction bothered him daily. Then, on the 20th of October, Quirrell entered the corridor after curfew. Harry saw him do it. He had not been following Quirrell that evening. He and Hermione had been returning from the library after an argument over whether magical portraits stored consciousness or merely simulated it, while Ron trailed behind complaining that both positions were equally unsettling. They were halfway up the main staircase when Quirrell crossed the landing below. He moved quickly, no stammer, no visible hesitation, turban tight, eyes fixed ahead. Then he turned not toward his rooms, nor toward any staff stairwell, but toward the prohibited passage leading to the third-floor corridor. Harry stopped dead. Hermione almost walked into him. "What?" Harry lifted one finger for silence. All three of them watched Quirrell disappear around the corner. Ron's freckles seemed to pale. "Why's he going there?" "Unknown," Harry said softly, "which makes it useful." Hermione was already gripping her books harder. "We can't follow him." "Not directly." Ron stared at him. "That is not the same as no." "No," Harry agreed. They moved quietly to the edge of the landing and listened. At first nothing. Then faint through stone and distance the unmistakable growl of something very large waking up. A second later came a sharp, muffled sound like a spell hitting wood. Then another. Then silence again. Harry counted heartbeats. 41, 42, 43 steps. Fast ones. Quirrell re-emerged below, robe hem twisted, one sleeve torn, moving at speed without any of his usual theatrical awkwardness. He looked back over his shoulder once. Even at that distance, Harry could see sweat gleaming at his hairline beneath the turban. Quirrell vanished down the staff staircase. The three of them remained frozen. Ron spoke first, voice barely audible. "He was trying to get past the dog." Hermione looked stricken. "But he's a teacher." Harry's mind was already reorganizing. Quirrell, the corridor, secrecy, the concealed head, dark residue, a performed stammer, specific interest in Harry. The shape was becoming clearer, not complete, but clearer. "We need to know what's under the trapdoor," Harry said. Ron made a strangled noise. "No, we don't. We absolutely don't." "We do," Hermione said quietly, and Harry turned to see that her shock had already begun hardening into resolve. "Because if he's trying to get to it, then whatever's there is the center of the case." Ron looked between them with the expression of a boy realizing he had somehow acquired two dangerously competent lunatics as friends. "I hate this," he muttered. "You don't," Harry said. Ron thought about it. "No," he admitted miserably, "I really don't." Information about the object under the trapdoor did not come easily, which only increased Harry's suspicion that it mattered. Hagrid, while affable, was terrible at withholding anything he did not realize he was withholding, but excellent at clamming up the instant a question sounded too close to a real secret. McGonagall, when Hermione innocently asked whether school security often involved Cerberus-type guardians, gave her a stare so direct that Hermione returned to her potatoes and did not attempt the line again for 2 weeks. So Harry changed methods. Instead of asking directly what the dog guarded, he investigated who around the school might have reason to know. That led, somewhat astonishingly, to Nicholas Flamel. The name surfaced first in a tiny aside from Hagrid, then again in a library reference to alchemical patronage, then a third time in an index too obscure for coincidence. Harry knew at once that he was looking at a concealed center, not because the name itself meant much yet, but because it kept appearing at the edge of multiple systems. Magical metallurgy, longevity studies, late medieval alchemical circles, and Gringotts vault ownership. Hermione took the library campaign personally. If there was one thing Hermione Granger hated on moral grounds, it was an archive with poor indexing. For 11 days, she attacked the library as though the shelves had insulted her family. Ron assisted unwillingly but usefully, because his talent for complaining while carrying heavy stacks of books made him, paradoxically, an effective research mule. Harry handled synthesis, cross-reference, and elimination. The breakthrough came at 9:30 on a Thursday when Hermione slammed a book onto the table with the triumph of an explorer discovering a hidden continent. "Nicholas Flamel," she said, breathless, "is the only known maker of the Philosopher's Stone." Ron frowned. "The what?" Harry looked up sharply. Hermione flipped pages. "A legendary alchemical object. It turns base metals into gold and produces the elixir of life." Silence. Then Harry sat back very slowly. Immortality. Wealth, portable, concealable, irreplaceable, something worth protecting, something worth stealing. Something, perhaps, worth killing for. He reached for the book, scanned the passage, then closed his eyes briefly as the pattern locked together. Quirrell was trying to reach the trapdoor. The trapdoor guarded the stone. The stone granted life extension. Harry's parents' killer, if the letter and all subsequent context could be trusted, had failed to die properly. Suddenly, the entire case acquired gravitational center. Hermione was watching him. "You see it too?" "Yes." Ron looked from one to the other, alarm rising. "See what?" Harry spoke carefully because he did not yet want theory outrunning proof. "The stone is not merely valuable," he said. "It's specifically useful to anyone who is injured, incomplete, or trying to avoid death." Ron swallowed. "You think Quirrell wants it?" "I think Quirrell is trying to get it. Whether for himself remains unproven." Hermione's eyes narrowed. "For someone else." Harry looked at her. She looked back. Neither of them said the name, not yet. The idea that Quirrell might be controlled began as a speculation, and hardened into something close to working hypothesis over the next fortnight. The evidence accumulated in small, ugly ways. Harry noticed Quirrell sometimes put a hand not to his chest or throat when nervous, as anxious men often did, but to the back of his head, fingers pressing briefly against the turban as if in pain or in response to some internal pressure. During one defense lesson, when a student's hex rebounded into a wall and filled the room with sparks, Quirrell spun not with the startlement of a frightened man but with swift, lethal readiness. For an instant, his entire body changed. The shoulders squared, the gaze sharpened, the stammer vanished. Then the moment passed, and the timid professor returned like a curtain dropped over steel. Harry wrote 6 pages that night. He compared the phenomenon to known examples of divided presentation, psychological fracture, coercive influence, and habitual disguise. None fit perfectly. Then Hermione, reading over his shoulder in an empty classroom after charms, tapped one line with her finger. "What if we're assuming the wrong number of people?" Harry blinked. "Go on." She sat opposite him, lowering her voice instinctively, though no one else was near. "We keep talking as if Quirrell is one person wearing one mask. But what if he's not alone?" Harry stared. Hermione pushed the notebook toward him and began assembling the argument with the brisk, relentless care that made her so dangerous to bad ideas. "The stammer isn't just inconsistent," she said. "It's almost as though it's being reapplied. The mannerisms, too, and if the back of his head is involved, if the residue is there, and the turban is there, and he reacts to you the way he does." Harry felt the air in the room change. "Physical attachment," he said. Hermione nodded, face pale but intent. Or occupation, possession, some magical equivalent. He said nothing for several seconds, because the theory was appalling and because it explained far too much: the smell, the residue, the concealment, the split effect, the specific interest in Harry, the attempts on the corridor, the possibility of someone too weakened to operate openly, someone without a body of their own. Harry reached for his pen. Working hypothesis 4. Quirrell may be host to a second intelligence/parasitic magical presence located at or near posterior cranium. He stopped, then added beneath it, if true, controller likely high risk. Hermione looked at the words and went very still. "You're thinking it," she said quietly. "Yes, you think it's him." Harry kept his eyes on the page. "I think the case is increasingly consistent with someone matching the profile of the person who attacked me as an infant, survived imperfectly, and now requires concealment plus life-restoring artifact." "The Dark Lord," Hermione whispered. Harry nodded once. For a moment neither of them moved. Then Hermione sat back, folded her arms tight against herself, and said the most Hermione thing possible under the circumstances. "We need more evidence before we tell anyone." Harry looked up. She met his gaze steadily. "I'm not saying we don't tell anyone. I'm saying we do not walk into Dumbledore's office with 'We think your defense professor has a murderous sorcerer on the back of his head,' unless we can support every part of that sentence." A fierce, relieved affection surged through Harry so quickly it almost made him laugh. "That," he said, "is exactly correct." Hermione exhaled. Then, "Also, hearing myself say it aloud was terrible." "Yes, good, just checking." If Sherlock had been there, he would have approved of what happened next and disapproved of the method by which it became necessary. The problem was evidence. They had behavioral inconsistency. Physical residue, suspicious movement toward the stone, concealment, a coherent motive for an external party, but they lacked something concrete enough to survive institutional denial. Sherlock had taught Harry to expect institutions to deny anything that threatened their own self-image. Hogwarts was no exception. If Harry accused a teacher of treachery, the school's first instinct would be to preserve the school, not reward the accusation. Therefore, the accusation had to arrive not as a possibility, but as a case. Harry needed one more line. It presented itself in the restricted section. He was not supposed to be there. That was, unfortunately, where the useful book was. Hermione had found a reference in a legal history volume to a discontinued classification of soul-anchoring practices, which Harry immediately suspected was connected to dark methods of survival. The reference cited a work stored in the restricted section. Access required written permission from a teacher. McGonagall would ask questions, Flitwick would ask more questions. Snape might grant it out of spite or curiosity, but Harry was not prepared to spend the political capital required to find out. So, at 11:15 on a rainy Monday night, Harry used the invisibility cloak Hagrid had given him at Christmas, still the most astonishing piece of magical engineering he had yet encountered, and slipped into the library with Hermione posted as lookout, and Ron posted farther down the corridor as emergency warning system. The cloak fascinated Harry every time he wore it. No observable light distortion, no shimmering edge, no obvious projection mechanism. It rendered absence seamless. He wanted to study it for weeks. Instead, he focused. The restricted section felt different from the rest of the library. Quieter, yes, but not merely through lack of students. The silence there had intent. Shelves stood closer together. Several books were visibly chained. Others seemed to recoil slightly when touched, which Harry did not care for at all. He found the cited volume after 12 minutes of systematic search. It was bound in black leather gone gray at the edges, with no title on the spine. He opened it, and nearly shut it again. The contents were not theatrical. That was the disturbing part. No dripping ink, no gibbering curses, no melodrama. Just clear, disciplined prose discussing methods by which identity, essence, and life force might be partitioned, transferred, bound, or degraded. Most of the text was abstract, legalistic, old enough to be dry. Then came a page with margin annotations in a different hand. Harry bent lower. The original text discussed post-bodily persistence through fragmentation. The annotations, cramped and elegant, corrected several conceptual errors in the printed theory and noted that multiple anchors decrease total integrity but improve survivability. Harry's pulse gave a heavy, singular thud, because he knew that handwriting, not personally, of course, but he had seen reproductions of it in old award rolls, student commendations, and archived essays Hermione had once pulled from a display case for a different line of inquiry. Tom Marvolo Riddle. Harry did not need certainty to recognize the style. The hand was too distinctive, precise, narrow, disciplined to the point of vanity. He copied the page reference, the wording, the annotation style, and the exact wording of the marginal note into his notebook, before replacing the volume exactly as he had found it. Then, as he turned to leave, he heard footsteps, not Hermione, too heavy, not Ron, too measured, Filch. Harry stepped back between two shelves and held himself perfectly still under the cloak, while Filch shuffled past muttering about rule-breaking little monsters and overdue fines, as though the books themselves had personally offended him. Harry did not breathe until Filch was gone. When he finally returned to the corridor, Hermione pulled the cloak off his head so sharply she nearly took his glasses with it. "You were gone 23 minutes, she hissed. It was worth it. Ron, pale and furious in the way only a frightened friend could be, folded his arms. "Say yes, and I'm leaving both of you to die next time." "Yes," Harry said. Ron groaned. Hermione seized the notebook and read the copied notes by wandlight. Her face changed. "Oh," she whispered. "Oh, that's bad. Yes, that's very bad. Yes." Ron looked between them. "Could one of you stop doing that and explain?" Harry lowered his voice further. "I found evidence that Tom Riddle researched or at minimum understood methods of survival through soul fragmentation." Ron blinked. "Soul what?" Hermione answered before Harry could. "It means we're right about the survival part, or close enough that the difference is academic." Ron went quiet, not because he understood every detail. He didn't, but he understood enough to know the shape of the danger. They stood there in the dark corridor, 3 first years with a stolen line of evidence and far too much knowledge, while rain tapped at the high windows and the castle settled around them like a beast pretending sleep. Then Ron said, very quietly, "We tell Dumbledore now." Harry looked at Hermione. Hermione looked at Harry, and both of them, for once, agreed with Ron immediately. The difficulty was not deciding to tell Dumbledore, the difficulty was deciding how. A vague warning would be dismissed, or worse, absorbed and hidden. Harry needed presentation, order, narrative integrity, a case one could not evade by pretending the pieces were disconnected. So he spent the next 4 days assembling it. He titled the document, "Preliminary Investigative Report Concerning Professor Quirinus Quirrell and the Security Risk to a Protected Artifact on Hogwarts Grounds." Hermione helped structure the sections. Ron, to his own horror, was assigned corroboration review because his gift for spotting when something sounded too abstract for ordinary people turned out to be invaluable. If Ron could follow the argument, a headmaster could. Section 1, Behavioral Anomalies. Section 2, Physical Evidence and Chemical Residue. Section 3, Unauthorized Corridor Access and Attempted Breach of Protected Zone. Section 4, Historical Context regarding Survival Motives and Tom Riddle's Annotated Interest in Fragmented Persistence. Section 5, Working Hypothesis and Risk Assessment. Harry wrote clearly, unemotionally, and with ruthless distinction between observed fact and inference. He did not accuse Quirrell outright of being a host to Voldemort, though the reports strongly implied it. He did not dramatize the danger. He quantified what he could. He admitted uncertainty where it existed. He attached notes, dates, timings, and diagrams. Hermione added citations. Ron demanded they remove 2 phrases that sounded like you swallowed a dictionary and then got angry about it. Harry removed them. By the end, the document was 23 pages long. Hermione read the final version twice. Ron read it once, grimacing through the longer words. Then Hermione looked up and said, "This is real." Ron nodded reluctantly. "It sounds terrifying in a proper adult way." Harry capped his pen. "Good," he said. "Then tomorrow we take it to Dumbledore." Sleep eluded him that night, not because of fear, though there was some. Not even because of the possibility that their case might be wrong, though he had checked it often enough that he no longer believed that likely. No, what kept him awake was the quiet, growing recognition that tomorrow might change the balance of his entire life at Hogwarts. Until now, he had been observing a hidden world. Tomorrow he would force it to observe him back. That was different. That was irreversible. Very late, as moonlight shifted across the dormitory ceiling, Harry sat up, reached for his notebook, and wrote one final private line beneath the formal report draft. If he is really there, if it is really him, then this began before I could speak. I would prefer it not end the same way. He closed the notebook, then at last slept. Dumbledore read the report in silence. That was the first thing Harry noticed. He did not skim. He did not interrupt. He did not offer those infuriating little sounds adults sometimes made when children presented serious thoughts and the adults wished to preserve authority by performing patience. He simply read. Harry, Hermione, and Ron sat opposite the desk in the headmaster's office, while silver instruments clicked faintly around them and Fawkes the Phoenix watched from his perch with unnerving, ancient calm. The office smelled of parchment, wax, and something sharper beneath it, ozone, perhaps, or old magic. Dumbledore turned a page, then another. Harry watched his eyes because eyes often betrayed what expressions concealed. Surprise on page 4. Irritation on page 7, not with them, Harry thought, but with the content. Genuine interest on page 10. Something more serious on page 14 when he reached the section on the annotated restricted text and Tom Riddle's likely interest in survival through partition. By the time he finished, the room felt smaller. Dumbledore folded the report once and placed it very carefully on the desk. "You have," he said at last, "been conducting an investigation." "Yes," Harry said. There was a beat. Rather a thorough one. Hermione sat straighter. Ron seemed to be trying not to evaporate. Dumbledore's gaze moved over all three of them but rested, inevitably, on Harry. "You did not think to bring these concerns to a professor sooner?" Harry had expected the question. "We considered doing so with incomplete evidence," he said. "But if the danger involves a teacher and an object under active protection by the staff, then a partial warning would either be dismissed or alert the subject prematurely. A complete case seemed more useful." Dumbledore regarded him for a long, unreadable moment. "That," he said softly, "is not how children generally reason." Harry kept his expression neutral. "I was not raised generally." Something flickered in Dumbledore's face, then not quite amusement, not quite regret. Recognition, perhaps. Recognition that the boy in front of him was not one he had planned for. Hermione, brave as ever when silence became dangerous, said, "Sir, whatever Professor Quirrell is doing, he's trying to get past the dog. We saw him." "And the residue Harry found, if it's linked to dark magic," Dumbledore lifted one hand gently, not to silence her dismissively, but to pause the flood. "Yes," he said. "I understand the seriousness of what you're suggesting." Ron swallowed audibly. Harry leaned forward slightly. "With respect, Headmaster, the seriousness of what we are suggesting is precisely why we brought documentation rather than alarm. If Professor Quirrell is acting under outside control, and if the object in the corridor is the Philosopher's Stone, then the relevant question is not whether there is risk. There is. The question is whether the risk is contained." Dumbledore's eyes sharpened, not angrily, intelligently. Harry had seen that look before, often enough, on Sherlock's face when someone finally said something worth the full measure of his attention. "You infer a good deal," Dumbledore said. "I document a good deal," Harry replied. "The inferences are marked separately." For one impossible second, Harry thought the old man might laugh. He did not. But the beard shifted suspiciously. Instead, Dumbledore stood, moved to the window, and looked out over the grounds. When he spoke again, his voice had changed. Less avuncular, more precise. The object beneath the trapdoor, he said, will be moved. Ron let out a breath in a small explosion of relief. Professor Quirrell, Dumbledore continued, will be addressed. Hermione closed her eyes briefly. Harry did not relax, because there was one thing left. The name in the margin annotations, Dumbledore said without turning. The name you do not write directly in the report, but clearly imply. Do you understand the weight of it? Harry answered without hesitation. I understand that Tom Riddle may have survived by means not yet fully known, that he may be operating through or with Professor Quirrell, and that this would connect directly to the attack that killed my parents. Yes. Dumbledore turned then. The blue of his eyes behind the half-moon spectacles was suddenly very old. And what, he asked quietly, do you intend to do with that understanding? Harry thought of Baker Street, of Sherlock's hands steepled in the firelight, of Watson saying good men must not look away from difficult truths simply because they hurt, of Mrs. Hudson, who believed chaos was tolerable only if one made tea first and dealt with it properly. Then he thought of the green light in his dreams. He met Dumbledore's gaze. I intend, Harry said, to continue the investigation. Silence filled the office. Then Dumbledore gave a small, weary nod. Yes, he said, I thought perhaps you might. He returned to the desk and set one hand lightly on the report. This is excellent work, he said, also extremely dangerous work. I will not ask you to stop observing, that would plainly fail, but I will ask you not to place yourselves in direct jeopardy without informing a trusted adult. Ron muttered under his breath, that sounds aimed at us. Hermione elbowed him sharply. Harry considered the request, measured it, and gave the most honest answer available. We will adjust our thresholds for risk. Dumbledore's mouth twitched. That is not quite a promise. No, Harry said. It isn't. To his credit, Dumbledore did not demand one. Instead, he picked up the report, tapped its pages once into alignment, and said, You have done Hogwarts and me a considerable service. 10 points each to Ravenclaw and Gryffindor. Ron blinked. What? Dumbledore looked mildly surprised. Mr. Weasley, unless I have misread the report, you were involved. Yes, but mostly in a terrified way. Courage takes many forms, Dumbledore said. Ron went very red. A minute later they were dismissed. At the door, Dumbledore spoke once more. Harry turned. For a moment the headmaster seemed about to say something else, something more personal, perhaps, or more complicated. What he settled on was simpler. You are, he said, not at all what I expected. Harry thought of Sherlock again, of the letter, of the doorstep, of all the lives other people had likely imagined for him before he was old enough to object. He answered with complete sincerity. I've been told that's generally useful. Dumbledore's laugh, when it came, was brief and real. Yes, he said, I dare say it may be. They left the office in a strange quiet, not unhappy, not frightened, just full. The castle corridor outside seemed almost absurdly ordinary after what had just happened. Torches, stone, drafts under old doors. Somewhere far away, Peeves was singing a song about exploding custard. Ron was the first to break. Well, he said, voice cracking halfway through, that was the worst and best thing that's ever happened to me. Hermione laughed, a short, astonished sound she seemed to hear only after she made it. Harry felt it then, not triumph exactly. This was too serious for triumph, but something close to steadiness. The kind that came when evidence had been seen, named, and properly placed in the world instead of carried alone. We did the right thing, Hermione said quietly. Yes, Harry replied. Ron looked between them. Are you two about to start another case immediately? Harry and Hermione exchanged a glance. Then Harry said, Not immediately. Ron narrowed his eyes. That word is doing a lot of work. He was right, of course, because Quirrell was only one piece. Even if Dumbledore acted perfectly from here, and Harry did not assume perfection in anyone, the report had revealed something deeper than a single traitorous professor. It had revealed a system with gaps, a history only half told. A conflict older than Harry, but somehow still circling him like a pattern not yet complete. The first school mystery had not ended. It had merely moved to a new phase. Harry knew that as surely as he knew the castle around them was still keeping secrets. But for now, one matter had been handled properly. For now, the stone would move. For now, Quirrell would be watched. For now, 3 first years had dragged a hidden threat into daylight and survived the process. That was not nothing. They walked back toward the tower together, their footsteps thinning into the late evening hush of Hogwarts, while beyond the windows the grounds lay under cold starlight, and the dark water of the lake reflected the sky with deceptive calm. Up in his dormitory much later, after Ron had complained himself to sleep in Gryffindor and Hermione had undoubtedly reorganized her notes before bed, Harry opened his notebook one last time. Under the final line of the Quirrell report, he wrote, "Case status. Escalated to institutional authority. Immediate threat mitigated. Larger pattern remains unresolved." He paused. Then, after a moment, added a second line beneath it. Sherlock would say the first deduction is rarely the last. Harry smiled faintly, closed the book, and set it aside. In the darkness, Hogwarts breathed around him, ancient, watchful, full of rooms and histories and dangers that had not yet learned to fear being examined. Harry Potter, staring up at the canopy of his bed, felt the now familiar thrill of a puzzle that had only just begun to reveal its true shape. And somewhere, deep in the castle, something hidden shifted in response. The game was no longer quiet. It was underway. Chapter 4, The Horcrux Audit. The Quirrell case ended in a manner Harry found deeply unsatisfactory, which was how he knew it had probably ended realistically. Professor Quirrell did not confess before the entire school in a flood of theatrical villainy. No dramatic revelation rang through the great hall. There was no public accounting, no elegant final statement of motive and method. Instead, 3 days after Harry delivered his report to Dumbledore, the defense professor failed to appear at breakfast. By noon, word had spread among the staff in whispers. By evening, the official version had settled into place. Professor Quirrell had suffered a severe magical collapse and would not be returning to Hogwarts. Students accepted this with the speed of people who had no mechanism for knowing how often institutions lied for what they believed were good reasons. Harry did not accept it at all. He accepted that something had happened. He accepted that Dumbledore had acted. He accepted that the stone was gone because the entire third-floor corridor felt different afterward, emptier, like a room after a dangerous object had been removed. But the explanation itself was far too tidy. Magical collapse was not a cause, it was a phrase. What does that even mean? Harry asked Hermione in the library 2 nights later. Hermione, now fully accustomed to translating wizarding vagueness into useful irritation, pushed her notes aside. "It means either they don't want to say or they don't know how to say." Ron lowered his voice. "Fred says Quirrell screamed loud enough to wake portraits on 2 floors. Harry looked up sharply. "When?" "Night before last. He heard one of the prefects talking about it," said Dumbledore. "Snape and McGonagall were all on the 4th floor at once." Harry's mind moved quickly. 4th floor? He repeated, "Not 3rd." Hermione caught up a second later. "So Dumbledore didn't confront him in the corridor?" "No, which means Quirrell either anticipated the stone's movement or had already shifted focus to something else." Ron frowned. "You can tell that from a floor?" Harry gave him a look of great patience. "From a contradiction." Ron muttered something about Ravenclaws and their moral duty to make ordinary conversation unbearable, but the contradiction mattered. Quirrell had been watched. The stone had been removed. Yet something severe enough to require an institutional cover story had still occurred, which meant Quirrell's objectives had extended beyond a single artifact. Or else the person controlling him had. That idea stayed with Harry through the remainder of first year. It stayed with him through exams. Through Flitwick's visible delight at having a student who treated spell precision like engineering. Through McGonagall's increasingly nuanced decision to oscillate between approving Harry's method and discouraging the parts of it that resembled self-assigned investigative authority. Through Snape's relentless, exacting hostility, which Harry had now concluded was no longer simple hostility. but a complicated response to being forced to acknowledge competence in a boy he had clearly expected to dislike without difficulty. Most of all, it stayed with Harry because Dumbledore told him almost nothing. The headmaster did summon him once before term ended. It happened in the evening, with the sky beyond the office windows still faintly blue and Fawkes asleep with his beak tucked beneath one wing. Dumbledore invited him in, offered tea, and regarded him for a while over folded hands as though deciding how much truth to distribute. "You were correct that Professor Quirrell was compromised," Dumbledore said at last. Harry waited. Compromised how? Dumbledore's blue eyes remained steady, in a manner both magical and deeply dark. "That is descriptive, not explanatory." "It is also," said Dumbledore, "the most I am prepared to say at present." Harry felt the now familiar flare of irritation. Not childish frustration, he would have recognized that and dismissed it. This was cleaner than that. It was professional disagreement. "With respect, Headmaster, withholding mechanism from someone directly implicated in the case weakens future analysis." "Yes," Dumbledore said mildly, "it can." That answer was so disarming in its honesty that Harry nearly lost the thread of his annoyance. "So you agree?" Harry said. "I agree that there are costs," said Dumbledore. "There are also risks. You are 11, Harry. I noticed." "And there are matters," Dumbledore said, "which become more dangerous the more precisely they are understood." Harry held the old man's gaze. Then, "That argument only holds if ignorance prevents contact. It does not, generally, prevent vulnerability." A flicker crossed Dumbledore's expression. Recognition again, recalibration again. "You were indeed not raised generally," he murmured. "No." A long pause followed. Then Dumbledore rose, crossed to a cabinet, and removed a small object wrapped in black cloth. He placed it on the desk between them and folded back the cloth. Harry stared. It was not the Philosopher's Stone. Smaller. Darker. A fragment of burnt cloth or turban fabric, stiffened at one edge by something crusted and metallic. Even before he touched it, Harry could feel the wrongness in it, the faint, nauseating pulse of something that had once carried malice and still remembered the shape. "Collected after the confrontation," Dumbledore said. "Professor Quirrell is dead." Harry went still. Not because Quirrell's death shocked him morally. Quirrell had been dangerous, possibly murderous, almost certainly complicit in horrors Harry had not yet fully named. But because death ended one avenue and opened 10 more questions. How? Dumbledore's voice was very quiet. The force inhabiting him abandoned him when it could no longer maintain hold. Harry's eyes moved from the cloth to Dumbledore. The force. Yes. So there was another presence? There was. Harry exhaled once through his nose. Confirmation, not complete but real. "The same one that attacked me as an infant." Dumbledore did not answer immediately. That was answer enough. Harry looked down at the blackened fragment again. "May I examine it?" Dumbledore's smile was slight and tired. "I suspected that would be your first request. And your answer?" "My answer," said Dumbledore, wrapping the cloth once more, "is no." Harry closed his mouth. Dumbledore's gaze softened by a fractional degree. "Not because I doubt your care. Because I know your mind. If I place this in your hands, Harry, you will follow it until it leads somewhere dangerous, and you are not yet equipped for where it may lead." Harry wanted, very badly, to argue. He also knew when argument would fail by structure rather than merit. This was one of those times. Dumbledore had already resolved the issue internally. Any further push would only narrow future access, so Harry chose a different tactic. "Then tell me one thing," he said. "Was Quirrell the source of the danger or only the vehicle?" Dumbledore looked at him for a long moment. Then, "Only the vehicle." Harry nodded once. That was enough for now. It was not enough forever. The summer at Baker Street became, in retrospect, the beginning of the audit. Harry returned with trunks, homework, a list of unresolved magical inconsistencies, and the clear conviction that the hidden war he had brushed against in first year had not ended with Quirrell. Sherlock took one look at the growing dossier Harry unloaded onto the sitting-room table and made the sound he reserved for cases that had just become worth canceling appointments over. "You were correct," Harry said without preamble. "Quirrell was compromised by a separate entity. Dumbledore confirmed it indirectly and withheld all useful detail. Sherlock sat down, steepled his fingers, and read Harry's notes in silence. Mrs. Hudson, who had been ready to ask whether school food was adequate and whether Scottish children washed properly, changed tack instantly and brought tea. Watson, reading the first page over Harry's shoulder, whistled under his breath. "And you're sure this isn't merely the school's way of describing a nervous breakdown?" Harry pointed to the chemical residue section. Watson nodded. "Fair." Sherlock finished the report, then the addendum, then the notes Harry had reconstructed from memory after the Dumbledore meeting. He set the papers down in exact alignment. "What are the constants?" he asked. Harry had expected the question. "A hidden entity capable of partial survival after bodily destruction, strong likelihood of prior connection to my parents' deaths, Quirrell acting as host, not origin, clear interest in powerful restorative or protective artifacts, Dumbledore aware of more than he shares, Hogwarts as both target and battleground." Sherlock inclined his head. "Good, and what is the mistake most people would make from this point?" Harry answered at once. "They'd assume Quirrell was the event." "Exactly." Sherlock leaned back. "Quirrell was not the event, Quirrell was evidence." That sentence became the hinge on which Harry's thinking turned. Evidence, not climax, not closure. Evidence, the entity that had used Quirrell had wanted the stone, yes. But even without it, it had persisted long enough to inhabit another human being, which meant its survival mechanism preceded Quirrell and would outlast him unless identified and dismantled. One did not solve such a case by winning a single confrontation. One solved it by tracing the architecture that made the confrontation possible at all. Harry opened a fresh casebook. Across the top of the first page, in his neatest hand, he wrote, "Cold Case, the Survival Mechanism of TM." Riddle Sherlock read the title and said nothing. But the silence had approval in it. Second year began with a disaster Harry identified almost at once as neither accidental nor isolated. The attacks started in October. A cat found petrified. Then a first-year Hufflepuff. Then a ghost disturbed beyond ordinary haunting. The school slid rapidly from unease into fear, while the administration performed its standard dance of half-information and optimistic posture. Harry watched all of it with increasingly cold attention, because unlike most students, he had spent a year learning the pattern underneath Hogwarts chaos. The castle did not suffer isolated mysteries. It suffered systems failures that looked isolated only if one refused to connect them. The messages on the wall were the first hard clue. The Chamber of Secrets has been opened. Enemies of the heir, beware. Most students saw menace and superstition. Harry saw authorial intent. Whoever wrote that message wanted an audience, wanted myth activated, wanted the attacks interpreted not as random violence but as deliberate historical continuation. This was not merely an act, it was a citation. Hermione agreed immediately. "It's invoking precedent," she said in the library that night, her voice low and quick. "The message assumes the chamber already exists in school culture. That means the attacker wants to inherit an existing narrative, not create a new one." Ron rubbed a hand over his face. "Can we have one school year where nobody inherits anything murderous?" "No," Harry said. "Apparently not." The second clue was stranger. Harry heard the voice, not with his ears exactly, not in the ordinary sense. More like language moving beside sound, sliding through walls and stone with an intimate, hideous intent. Come to me, let me tear, let me kill." He stopped in the corridor so abruptly that Hermione nearly collided with him. "What is it?" she whispered. Harry's face had gone very still. "There's something in the walls," he said softly. Ron stared. "What does that mean?" "It means I can hear something no one else appears able to hear." Hermione's eyes sharpened. "What kind of something?" Harry listened again. The voice had gone. "I don't know yet." He did not tell them immediately what the voice sounded like. Not because he distrusted them, but because naming something too early often froze people around the wrong explanation. Better to log first, interpret later. So he did. Event. Recurrent vocal phenomenon audible only to me. Directional source uncertain. Moves through castle structure. content predatory, language, English. Over the following weeks, the pieces assembled with a speed that would have impressed Sherlock and horrified almost everyone else. The attacks involved petrification, not death. The victims either encountered reflective surfaces, indirect lines of sight, or obstructed perception. Spiders fled the castle in visible panic. Moaning Myrtle's bathroom showed unusual corridor traffic near attack windows, and the voice in the walls spoke of killing as a hunger, not a strategy. By the time Hermione brought him a creature reference guide with the page on basilisks marked in 3 places, Harry already knew what he would find there: a serpent, ancient, lethal gaze, travel possible through pipes if large enough and magically sustained. Ron read the page and turned pale green. "There's a giant murder snake in the plumbing." "Yes," Harry said, "that sentence should not exist." "No," Hermione agreed, "but it does explain the indirect petrifications. If no one looked at it directly, they'd survive but be petrified." Ron looked between them. "I hate that both of you sound calmer now that it's a giant murder snake." "Because now it's specific," Harry said. That was the first major break in the chamber case. The second came in the form of a diary. Ginny Weasley, quiet all year in a way Harry had slowly come to recognize as strain, not shyness, dropped a black notebook outside the library steps. Harry picked it up automatically, intending to return it. The cover was blank. Inside, most pages were empty, most, but not all. On the inside back cover, in precise ink faded only slightly with time, was a name. T.M. Riddle. Harry stopped moving. The cold that passed through him had nothing to do with weather. He did not yet know whether T.M. Riddle was necessarily Tom Marvolo Riddle, but the probability was high enough that his pulse had already changed by the time Ginny, white-faced and breathless, reached him. "You found it," she said, not relieved. Terrified, Harry looked up at once. Ginny's expression lasted only an instant before she forced it into something weaker and more plausible. I mean, thank you, it's just an old diary." Harry handed it over. Her fingers shook taking it. That night he wrote 5 pages on that reaction alone. A dropped object can be accidental. A reaction rarely is. The next morning the diary was missing again. This time Harry did not return it. He found it abandoned in a girl's lavatory with its pages still blank, and the faintest impression of recent writing pressed into paper that, moments later, vanished. He brought it to Hermione and Ron in an unused classroom and set it on the desk like evidence in a murder trial. Hermione stared. "That's the same name?" "Yes." Ron squinted. "Riddle could be common." "It isn't," Harry said. He opened the diary and, using the same skeptical patience Sherlock had trained into him, wrote on the page, "Who are you?" The ink sank. For a moment nothing happened. Then words appeared in a hand not his own. "My name is Tom Riddle." Ron swore. Hermione made a sound like a kettle just before boiling. Harry's face did not change, though his hand tightened slightly on the pen. He wrote again. "How are you answering?" The reply formed at once. "I preserve memory. I converse with those who write." Harry looked at that sentence for a long time, then he asked questions, not the dramatic ones. "Not are you the Dark Lord, or what are you?" Those would only produce either lies or silence. Instead, he began at the edges. He tested response times. He varied phrasing. He asked about Hogwarts history in ways that let him compare the diary's knowledge to verifiable sources. Hermione, catching the method instantly, started a separate chart of inconsistency markers. By the end of the first session, Harry had 3 conclusions. First, the diary was not simply storing memory. It was interactive, adaptive, and capable of strategic omission. Second, the intelligence inside it possessed self-awareness, motive, and selective emotional tone. Third, it was lying about the limits of its own nature. "It's not a memory," Harry said finally, capping the pen. Hermione nodded slowly. "No." Ron looked at the page as though it might bite him. "Then what is it?" Harry thought of Quirrell, of Dumbledore's half-answers, of the annotated restricted text on post-bodily persistence through fragmentation. "A piece," he said, "or a copy built from a piece." Hermione's eyes widened. "Of Riddle?" "Yes." She sat down very carefully. "Harry, if that's true, It means Quirrell wasn't an exception, Harry said. He was a continuation. What followed was the first real audit. Harry stopped thinking in terms of singular villain and started thinking in terms of distributed survival. If Riddle had preserved some interactive form of himself in an object, a diary, no less, chosen not for power but for utility, then Quirrell's possession had likely not been his only mechanism. The annotated text suddenly looked less like obscure theory and more like application. Harry returned to the restricted section notes from first year and built outward: motivation, pathological fear of death, temperament, theatrical, symbol-driven, intellectually vain. Resource profile, access to rare objects, old magic, and periods of unsupervised experimentation during school years and beyond. Therefore, if he fragmented survival, he would not do so once unless one were enough. And if he did it more than once, he would likely choose objects of symbolic or personal significance. Hermione took to this line of reasoning with frightening speed. He wouldn't use random items, she said, pacing between library shelves with books balanced in both arms. He'd want meaning. Heritage, legacy, monuments, Harry said, exactly. Ron, sitting on the floor with Hogwarts, a history open over his knees, looked up. Normal people, when trying not to die, do not think this is a good time for dramatic symbolism. Harry turned a page. Tom Riddle was not normal people. They began tracing him, not openly, not in ways that would attract notice from the wrong professors, but methodically. Yearbooks, awards, old copies of the Daily Prophet, property records Hermione discovered through legal appendices no one else bothered to read, mentions of the Gaunt family, artifacts associated with Hogwarts founders, collectors, dark shop inventories. The diary itself became their harshest teacher. It lied, but not perfectly. Every lie established a shape around the truth it was trying to avoid. When Harry asked if it was alive, it claimed not to understand the term. When Hermione asked if it could exist independently of the book, it redirected to nostalgia about school corridors. When Ron, on a whim, asked whether it could feel anger, the ink appeared so heavily it nearly cut through the paper. I feel many things. Right, Ron said, leaning back. Hate the book, definitely hate the book. Harry hated it too, though for more controlled reasons. Its intelligence was elegant in exactly the wrong way. Cold, charming when useful, vicious when cornered. Every line of it suggested a mind trained toward manipulation long before it had grown powerful enough to become dangerous at scale. One evening, after an hour of careful questioning, the diary made a mistake. Harry wrote, "What happened the last time the chamber opened?" The reply came quickly. "A girl died. The school almost closed. I saved it by identifying the culprit." Harry's pen hovered. Not someone saved it, I saved it. The statement was not merely historical. It was possessive. He looked up at Hermione. She had caught it too. "You were there," Harry wrote, a pause. Then, "Yes." "How much of him is in there?" Hermione whispered. Harry did not answer. He was watching the page, because the question now was not whether Tom Riddle had preserved part of himself in the diary. The question was what kind of part could still claim a school crime 40 years later as personal history. That was not memory. That was continuity. They solved the chamber before it could kill. That, years later, Harry considered one of the only true triumphs of his adolescence, not because it was clean. It wasn't. Nothing involving giant serpents, ancient prejudices, and soul-bound notebooks was ever clean, but because they got there in time. The final chain came together over 6 days. Myrtle confirmed where she had died and what she had seen. Yellow eyes at sink level, a voice she never understood, death without warning. The diary, pressed hard enough, betrayed knowledge of the entrance mechanism by omission, never naming the location, but reacting when Harry listed possible sites tied to female ghosts, plumbing anomalies, and historical concealment. Ginny Weasley disappeared. That last piece accelerated everything. Ron found the note first, crumpled near the abandoned diary in Myrtle's bathroom. Her skeleton will lie in the chamber forever. The school erupted into panic. Teachers were mobilized. Lockhart was useless in the specific, expected way he was useless about most things. Harry did not waste time on him. He wasted none on ceremony either. By then, he knew two more things. First, he could open the entrance. The strange language he sometimes heard in dreams, the hissing one he had never mentioned, because it did not fit any known category worked on the snake engraving beneath the sinks. Second, the diary wanted him there, which meant the diary either overestimated itself or required something only he could provide. Both options were dangerous. They went anyway, not alone in the foolish, heroic sense. Harry had grown up with Sherlock Holmes. Foolish heroics were for people who thought emotion improved odds. No, they prepared. Ropes. Mirrors. A signaling system. Hermione remained above not because she wanted to. She argued brilliantly against it, but because someone had to maintain surface response if the tunnel collapsed or the teachers proved incompetent. Ron went with Harry because Harry trusted him to do exactly two priceless things under pressure. Remain frightened in a realistic way and keep moving anyway. They found Ginny before the basilisk found them. That made all the difference. She lay weak but breathing beside the diary, while the memory piece of Tom Riddle stood above her in a form no longer ink and no longer entirely unreal. Young. Handsome. Controlled, the kind of face that would have trusted itself immediately and deserved none of it. Harry looked at him and felt, with absolute certainty, that he had met the core intelligence behind every previous shadow, not the full thing, not the end state, but the pattern at origin. Tom smiled. "So," he said, as though greeting an equal at a debate society. "You came?" Harry's eyes moved once over the chamber. Statues, serpents, architecture designed by someone who considered subtlety beneath him. Then back to Riddle. "You're not a memory," Harry said. Tom's smile sharpened. "No, you're a preserved fragment, a crude term, a functional one." Tom laughed softly. "Who taught you to speak like that?" Harry thought of Baker Street, someone who disliked imprecision. Riddle's expression changed: curiosity, thin and keen, interesting. What followed was not, strictly speaking, a duel of spells at first. It was a duel of method. Tom wanted fear, myth, revelation. He wanted Harry overwhelmed by the grandeur of the chamber and the horror of Ginny's condition. He wanted narrative superiority. Harry denied him all three. He kept talking, not to stall alone, though that mattered, to force self-disclosure, to make Tom define what he was so Harry could watch where vanity overrode caution. And vanity did. Tom admitted enough, not the full mechanism, never that, but enough to confirm intent, identity, and principle. That he had once been real was still in some sense real and had become more by learning to separate himself from ordinary mortality. "You split yourself," Harry said quietly. Tom's eyes glittered. "I extended myself." That was as close to confession as Harry needed. The basilisk came when Tom finally lost patience with words. There are versions of the chamber story, Harry knew later, that made what happened next sound cleaner than it was, more heroic, more singular. Those versions were dishonest. The truth was movement, panic, mirrors, stone dust. Ron nearly dying twice, Harry speaking to a serpent in a language he did not understand but somehow owned. And the sudden, horrifying realization that Tom was stronger the longer Ginny weakened. The diary was the anchor, not the basilisk. Not the chamber. The diary. Once Harry saw that, the rest aligned. He destroyed it with a basilisk fang, half by desperate necessity and half by instinctive recognition that the object mattered more than the apparition. Ink exploded from the diary like arterial blood. Tom screamed not in outrage alone, but in collapse. The entire personality form tore apart as though held together by a single tension now severed. For one impossible second, before it vanished, Tom Riddle looked at Harry not with hatred but with something worse. Recognition. Then he was gone. Ginny lived. The chamber closed behind them, and Harry came back to the surface carrying in his arms and in his mind the first proven instance of Tom Riddle surviving in object form. The audit was no longer theory. It was evidence. Dumbledore did not deny it this time. When Harry, Hermione, and Ron presented the chamber case cleaner than the Quirrell report. Harsher in its conclusions, the headmaster listened with the deep stillness of a man watching a feared future become difficult to postpone. The diary, Harry said, laying out the final pages of his analysis, was not enchanted in the ordinary sense. It contained a self-aware, preserved fragment of Tom Riddle at approximately 16 years of age, capable of interaction, manipulation, and parasitic vitality transfer. Its destruction terminated that fragment, which implies the mechanism is destructible, repeatable, and almost certainly not unique. Dumbledore's face had become very grave. Hermione added, "The historical profile makes repetition likely. His psychology alone suggests he wouldn't trust a single point of failure." Ron, still looking slightly ill whenever the diary was mentioned, said, "Basically, if he found one horrible immortality trick, he probably didn't stop at one." Dumbledore closed his eyes briefly, then opened them again. "Yes," he said. It was the first unqualified yes he had given them. Harry went still. "So you knew, I suspected," Dumbledore said. "Now I know more. That's not the same sentence?" "No," Dumbledore agreed. "It is not." They held each other's gaze for a long moment, old strategist and young investigator, each measuring the other's tolerances. Then Dumbledore said, "The word for what you destroyed is Horcrux." Hermione inhaled sharply. Ron said, "That sounds awful." "It is," Dumbledore said. Harry felt something settle inside him. A word, at last, Horcrux, the restricted section text, the diary, Quirrell, the survival mechanism, the force that had not died properly. The case had a name now, which meant it could be pursued properly. The years that followed were quieter only on the surface. Third year, while the school obsessed over Sirius Black, Harry pursued archives. Fourth year, while tournaments and politics and public spectacle consumed everyone else, Harry and Hermione cross-referenced records of objects tied to founders, bloodlines, and vanished collections. Fifth year, under Umbridge's regime of cheerful institutional rot, Harry performed the most disciplined research of his life. The audit grew. A cup tied to Hufflepuff through inheritance gaps and auction records. A locket linked to the Gaunt line and then to disappearance. A diadem with a hole in its provenance large enough to be deliberate. A snake living, mobile, symbolically perfect. A ring. A possibility of 7 total fragments if one followed both magical numerology and Riddle's vanity to their natural intersection. They did not guess wildly. They built. One document, then another. One annotation, one map, one theft record, one marginal note in a dark archive that told them where an object had ceased to behave like ordinary property and begun behaving like a secret. By fifth year, the original thin casebook had become a full file box in miniature. Hidden and warded in the back of a Ravenclaw study, alcove under charms Hermione trusted, and Harry checked anyway. Across the inside cover of the master document, Harry eventually wrote, "Cold Case, the survival mechanism of TM. Riddle current working conclusion, multiple Horcruxes, symbolic object selection, distributed mortality, destruction possible. Full count unresolved until the spectrometer." He built it in stages. Sherlock mailed components during holidays under the polite fiction that no schoolchild should need that much precision glassware, unless the school itself had become negligent. Hermione handled calibration mathematics. Harry modified the detection logic using residue data from Quirrell's fabric, basilisk fang destruction notes from the diary, and the known magical after patterns Dumbledore had reluctantly admitted correlated with Horcrux damage. The result was inelegant, ugly, unstable, and brilliant. It could detect a dark resonance frequency too specific to appear by chance. They tested it first on harmless cursed objects to establish false positive rates, then on the remnants of the destroyed diary, which Dumbledore, after a long silence and a visible internal argument, allowed Harry to examine under supervision. The instrument screamed, not literally, but the needle lurched so hard it bent. Harry stared at the reading. Then, over the next months, they used it to confirm what had once been only modeled inference. The ring, the locket, the cup, all real, all part of the same system. And then, on a rain-soaked evening in 5th year, Harry made the decision that would divide his life cleanly into before and after. He tested himself. Hermione did not know he intended to. That was the one time in all their work he chose not to tell her first, because he knew with painful certainty what her expression would be if he spoke the idea aloud before he had evidence. The idea had lived with him for over a year by then. Since the diary, since Quirrell, since every repeated emphasis on his scar, his survival, his connection to Riddle. If an accidental transfer had occurred on the night his parents died, if shattered soul, violent curse rebound, and infant proximity had combined under impossible conditions, then he was not merely witness. He was evidence. Harry sat alone in an unused classroom with rain tapping at the leaded windows and the spectrometer arranged carefully on the desk. His hands were steady, too steady, almost. He recognized the feeling from crime scenes with Sherlock. The mind becoming precise because emotion was waiting at the edge and must be kept there until after the work. He calibrated once, twice. He took a baseline reading of the room. Then he held the instrument's tuned array near the scar on his forehead. The needle moved, not a twitch, not vibration. A full, deliberate pull into the black marked range. Harry stared at it, then reset the device and repeated the test from a different angle. The same result. He sat down very slowly. For a while he did nothing. Did not write, did not think in full sentences. Merely existed in the quiet with the rain and the machine and the knowledge that had just ceased to be hypothetical. He had always suspected, at the farthest edge of reason, that the case might eventually turn inward. Now it had. There are moments when a human being becomes, in the same breath, smaller and larger than they were. Harry had one then. Smaller, because the thing he hunted was literally within the architecture of his own survival. Larger, because he refused instantly, absolutely, to allow that fact to own the case. At length, he reached for the notebook. His handwriting remained neat, though the first line pressed hard enough to almost tear the paper. Test result. Positive resonance from scar. Dark signature consistent with Horcrux class object, but structurally weaker and less stable than known artifact sample. He stopped. Then, after a long pause, added, working conclusion. Accidental fragment attachment probable. The door opened behind him. Hermione had always been too observant to be kept out for long. She took in the machine, Harry's face, the notebook, and went white before he said a word. No, she whispered. Harry turned the notebook toward her. She read again, then sat down because the alternative appeared to be falling. For several seconds neither of them spoke. At last Hermione said, very softly, "We fix it." It was not a comfort. It was a decision. Harry looked at her. There were tears in her eyes she was refusing to let fall because falling apart before the work was done offended her at a constitutional level. "Yes," he said, "we fix it." She drew in a breath that shook only once. "Non-fatally. That is now the central constraint." "Good," she said fiercely. "Because I reject every version of this story in which you die to solve a problem someone else made." Harry laughed, then one short, startled sound, sharp with affection and grief and relief all at once. Hermione reached across the desk and took his wrist, grounding him in the simplest possible way. Rain moved against the windows. The spectrometer needle slowly settled back to 0. Harry looked at it, then at the notebook, then at Hermione. The audit, which had begun as a cold case about a dead dark wizard, had just become something else. Not abstract, not historical, immediate, personal. Precise. He closed the notebook gently. "All right," he said. "Then we proceed." And because he was Harry Potter of Baker Street, because Sherlock Holmes had taught him from childhood that panic was only wasted motion when evidence still existed, because Watson had taught him that facts did not excuse abandoning the human beings inside them, because Hermione Granger was sitting across from him refusing the shape of every tragic ending before it could form, he did not break. He began planning. Chapter 5. Dismantling the Order. Once Harry Potter confirmed that a fragment of Tom Riddle's soul was lodged in his scar. Every other conflict in his life reorganized itself around a single principle. Time had become evidence. Not in the dramatic sense people like to attach to stories about destiny. Not because a prophecy clock had begun to tick audibly in the background, but because every month in which Voldemort's distributed survival mechanism remained intact was another month in which the wizarding world continued to behave like a patient refusing diagnosis, while the disease built structure around its denial. Harry hated denial. He hated it in individuals because it made them sloppy. He hated it in institutions because it made them lethal. By the beginning of fifth year, his working model of the larger problem looked like this. Voldemort had not merely returned. He had persisted, adapted, and reassembled influence through fear, ideology, old loyalties, and the sort of bureaucratic cowardice that allowed danger to flourish when danger came wrapped in political inconvenience. The Horcruxes were the mechanism of survival, but the Ministry of Magic was the mechanism of spread. And if one intended to destroy a disease properly, one did not only attack the tumor, one also cut off the blood supply. Harry said exactly this to Hermione on the first evening back at Grimmauld Place. She was standing by the drawing-room window with a stack of ministry directories balanced on one hip, reading by the low amber light of a lamp that made the entire old house look as though it regretted surviving into the present. Grimmauld Place itself was a useful study in decaying power. Inherited wealth, inherited prejudice, inherited structure all rotting in place while still exerting influence. An excellent symbol, Harry thought, for magical Britain. "You're saying the ministry is the circulatory system?" Hermione said, lowering the directory. "Yes, and Voldemort is the disease. More precisely, Voldemort is the disease agent. The ministry is the environment that lets it colonize." Ron, sprawled upside down in an armchair nearby, groaned. "Can you say anything normally?" Harry looked at him. "Would it help if I said the ministry is making everything worse in ways that are so stupid they loop back around to being sinister?" Ron considered. "Yes, that's much better." Hermione sat down, eyes bright with the exhausted intensity that always meant she was already 3 steps deeper into the argument than most people in the room. "Then we don't just need Horcrux destruction. We need institutional fracture. We need to break the systems that let his people move safely." "Exactly." Harry crossed to the table and opened the file he had brought from school, though file no longer seemed a large enough word. It was a layered archive, now property trails, artifact histories, ministry subcommittee votes, old educational decrees, public statements, donor affiliations, probation rulings, Wisengamot attendance records, and a growing psychological index of individuals Harry believed would matter when the final confrontation ceased to be hidden. He added a new cover sheet to the top stack. Parallel investigation. Institutional capture and coalition fragility. Ron read it upside down and shut his eyes. "That title alone should be illegal." "No," Hermione said, leaning in. "It's accurate." Harry uncapped his pen. "The Death Eaters aren't simply an army, they're a coalition. Coalitions fail at their seams, we need the seams." Ron lowered his feet to the floor. "What exactly does that mean in practice?" Harry's answer came at once. "It means we stop thinking of this as one war and start thinking of it as several interlocking failures. One magical, one political, one psychological, one informational." He began writing as he spoke. "Voldemort wins if he remains mythic, unified, and inevitable. Therefore our task is to make him documented, fractured, and exhaustingly real." There was a short silence. Then Hermione said, with unmistakable satisfaction, "That is a very good sentence." Harry nodded. "Yes." Ron looked between them, resigned to his fate. "Fine, all right, how do we do it?" Harry turned the page and began outlining the dismantling. The Ministry of Magic made its first major mistake before term had properly begun. Cornelius Fudge came to Hogwarts afraid. Fear, Harry had learned very early, was often more useful than confidence. Confident men lied with energy. Frightened men lied with pattern. Their evasions circled what mattered. Their emphases revealed vulnerabilities. Their attempts to control narrative exposed which version of events they most needed the public to believe. Fudge wanted the public to believe one thing above all, that Albus Dumbledore was manufacturing panic. The moment Harry understood that, the rest of the year acquired shape. At the hearing over Harry's use of underage magic, he watched Fudge with the same dispassionate concentration Sherlock might have applied to a crooked magistrate. Fudge's outrage was overperformed. His timing was too aggressive for a man secure in procedure. His attention drifted not toward the lore itself, but toward who else in the room was watching him. He wanted outcome, yes, but even more, he wanted optics. He needed Harry contained not because Harry was dangerous to public safety, but because Harry was dangerous to narrative stability. That meant Harry mattered politically now. He disliked that. He intended to use it anyway. After the hearing, while most people were still processing relief, Harry sat at the kitchen table in Grimmauld Place and wrote 4 pages on Fudge's body language alone. Hermione added a 5th, analyzing the procedural irregularities of the case. Ron supplied the extremely useful summary. He looked like a man trying to pretend he'd already won while checking whether anyone important believed him. Harry included that line verbatim in the margins. It was exact. When Dolores Umbridge arrived at Hogwarts, pink and smiling and poisonous, Harry recognized her type within 6 minutes. The surface details were almost insultingly obvious. Her voice was too sweet by design. Her clothes weaponized harmlessness. Her smile was never an expression, it was a positioning tool. The real evidence lay underneath. She did not observe a room to understand it. She observed it to classify loyalty. She did not speak to exchange information. She spoke to define permitted reality, and most tellingly of all, she did not merely enjoy authority. She enjoyed authority that had not been earned by competence, that made her dangerous in a different way from Voldemort. Voldemort, Harry thought, was a grand predator. Umbridge was institutional fungus, less dramatic, in some ways harder to remove. Hermione reached the same conclusion by the end of the first defense lesson. She's not teaching because she thinks practical defense is unnecessary, Hermione said later, pacing an abandoned classroom with the fury of a person morally offended by curriculum design. She's teaching like that because she thinks an unarmed population is easier to manage. Yes, Harry said. Ron, still furious in a more immediate and Weasley-shaped way, kicked the leg of a desk. She's going to get people killed. Harry's expression did not change. Potentially, yes. Hermione stopped pacing. So we document her. Harry looked up sharply. Hermione folded her arms. Not just complain. Not just resist. Document every decree, every overreach, every contradiction between official authority and actual conduct. For a brief moment, Harry said nothing at all. Then he gave the smallest nod. Yes, he said. Exactly. What began that evening became, over the next 8 months, one of the most complete institutional misconduct files Harry ever assembled. They built it in layers. The first layer was public behavior, educational decrees, classroom refusals, statements of policy, interference in curriculum, punishments disproportionate to infractions. Easy to observe, easy to record, useful for establishing method. The second layer was procedural abuse. Changes applied retroactively, selective enforcement, extralegal restrictions on student association, intimidation tactics against staff. More difficult. Required corroboration, dates, copies, witness statements, and internal consistency. The third layer was private cruelty. That was where the real case lived. Harry discovered the blood quill by direct experience. He did not scream when it happened. Not because it did not hurt, it hurt with astonishing precision, but because pain by itself was not useful information until organized. He watched the skin split under magical instruction, watched the words carve themselves into his hand, and cataloged the mechanism beneath the rage. A writing implement that converted compelled phrase into flesh inscription. Elegant, sadistic, administratively deniable. He returned to Gryffindor Tower pale and silent enough that Hermione knew instantly something was wrong. Ron knew half a second after that. Between them, they got the full explanation out of him in less than 5 minutes, at which point Hermione went white with fury, and Ron uttered a sentence so profane that 3 portraits pretended not to hear it. Then Harry did something neither of them expected. He sat down, wrapped his hand properly, and wrote the incident report before the blood had fully dried. Hermione stared. "Harry, if I wait," Harry said evenly, "memory will organize itself around outrage. Outrage is not evidence." Ron looked as though he wanted to throw the entire desk through a wall. Hermione, after one rigid second, sat down beside him and began writing a secondary witness account from observation immediately after the event. By midnight, they had the first complete entry in what Harry titled the Umbridge File. Procedural misconduct, abuse of office, and educational endangerment, he indexed it. By Christmas, it had 43 substantiated entries. The brilliance of the file, Harry thought later, was not in any one incident. It was in accumulation. Institutions could excuse one ugly action. They could explain away 2. They could even bury 5 if the people involved preferred comfort to conflict. But 43, properly dated, cross-referenced, and aligned against the legal limits of appointed ministry authority. 43 became pattern. Pattern became intent. Intent became liability. Harry did not yet release the file. He waited, because a good case was not merely accurate. It was timed. At the same time, he was building a second archive. The first was about Umbridge. The second was about the Death Eaters. This work moved more slowly, not because it was harder though it was, but because its variables were human in a way that paperwork was not. Harry had spent enough time with Sherlock to know that people were always the most complicated evidence on any case. Documents tended to stay where you put them. People changed shape under pressure. The Death Eaters, Harry concluded by the winter of 5th year, were not one thing. That mattered more than any Order member, except perhaps Sirius, seemed to fully appreciate. Most people who opposed Voldemort spoke about his followers as if they formed a coherent ideological machine. Harry thought that was intellectually lazy and strategically dangerous. Coherent ideological machines did exist, but they were usually smaller than people imagined and less stable than they appeared. The Death Eaters were better understood as a coalition held together by a strong central figure, and several overlapping incentives: fear, prestige, inherited prejudice, protection of wealth, resentment displaced into ideology, thrill in a few cases, though Harry found that subset contemptible rather than analytically interesting. He built profiles, not theatrical criminal portraits, but structured psychological assessments. Bellatrix Lestrange. Total identity fusion with leader figure, violence as devotional expression. Unlikely to fracture except through leader discredit or removal. Lucius Malfoy. Prestige, blood ideology, political ambition, deep investment in public status, vulnerable to evidence trails threatening property and family continuity. Avery, Knott, Yaxley, McNair each received pages, not complete, not perfect, but enough to begin seeing the internal architecture. Ron watched Harry mapping names and arrows one evening in the library and said, with a kind of horrified admiration, "You're diagramming fascism." "I'm diagramming a coalition," Harry said. "That doesn't make it better." "No," Harry agreed. "It makes it solvable." Hermione, reading over his shoulder, tapped one branch with the end of her quill. "This cluster here people with wealth and social standing, they aren't loyal for the same reason as Bellatrix." "Correct. They need Voldemort strong," Hermione said slowly, "but not chaotic." Harry nodded. "They want power under conditions they can still profit from. They don't want random collapse. They want structured dominance." Ron frowned. "And that helps us how?" Harry looked at the map. "Because structured dominance and apocalyptic terror are not the same project. If Voldemort pushes too far, some of them will begin privately preferring survival to devotion." Hermione's eyes lit. "Fault lines? Yes. And if we can identify enough of them, we don't need every Death Eater to defect," Harry said. "We only need to make the coalition stop behaving like a single organism." This became one of Harry's central wartime principles. You did not have to persuade every enemy. You only had to destroy their confidence that all the other enemies would remain aligned when pressure arrived. Once that confidence went, coordination failed. Once coordination failed, myth became management problem. Once myth became management problem, Voldemort ceased to be inevitable. Harry liked inevitability least of all. He and Dumbledore had their first truly serious conflict over prophecy. It happened late in the year, after Sirius's death, and Harry remembered the room more clearly than the words for a long time afterward. The headmaster's office felt dimmer than usual. Fawkes was silent. The silver instruments on the tables made their delicate sounds into air too tired to deserve them. Grief existed in the room as a physical condition. Harry entered carrying not only Sirius's death, but the accumulated weight of 5 years' partial answers. Dumbledore told him then about the prophecy. He told it carefully, thoughtfully, with sorrow genuine enough that Harry did not mistake it for performance. He explained what had been said, why Voldemort had marked Harry, why certain choices had followed. When he finished, silence held the office for several seconds. Then Harry said, with complete calm, "You have had this information for years." Dumbledore closed his eyes briefly. "I have. And you chose not to tell me." "I chose not," Harry said, "to tell me." Dumbledore opened his eyes. Harry stood very still by the desk. He was not shouting. That was part of what made the moment so sharp. Ron later said it would have been easier to watch if Harry had lost his temper. Hermione agreed. Rage people understood. Controlled indictment was another matter. "You decided," Harry went on, "that information directly relevant to my life, my risk profile, Voldemort's motives, and my decision-making should be withheld because you believed withholding it would protect me." "Yes," Dumbledore said quietly. Harry nodded once. "Then I would like to discuss the measurable failure rate of that strategy." The old man's face did not move. "Sirius is dead," Harry said. "Partly because I lacked information I should have had. My occlumency lessons failed partly because I was assigned to an instructor who had every emotional reason to mishandle them, and because I did not know the full stakes of failure. The Department of Mysteries confrontation occurred partly because I was allowed to remain strategically underinformed while still being expected to operate inside a conflict built around me." He paused. "That is not protection. That is exposure with sentiment attached." The silence that followed was one Harry would remember for the rest of his life, not because Dumbledore had no answer, because he had too many. When he finally spoke, the grief in his voice was painfully real. "You are not wrong." Harry looked down for one moment, then back up. "I am not asking for apology in place of adjustment," he said. "I am asking for adjustment." Dumbledore's gaze sharpened slightly through the sorrow. "What form would that take?" "Fuller disclosure," Harry said. "Not total if you genuinely believe there are narrow operational limits, but fuller, timelier. I cannot be treated as both the central variable in the conflict and a protected child excluded from its mechanism whenever the mechanism becomes unpleasant." A long breath left Dumbledore, then slowly he nodded. "You ask," he said, "to be treated as a partner?" Harry thought of Sherlock placing case files in front of him at 8 years old because the work mattered more than preserving a fiction of helplessness. "Yes," Harry said, "I do." Dumbledore's expression changed, then not into approval, not exactly, into recognition perhaps. Recognition that the boy before him had reached a line and would not retreat from it. "You are," Dumbledore murmured, "very unlike myself at your age." Harry considered. "I suspect that depends whom you had raising you." Something like a tired smile touched the old man's face. "Yes," he said, "I suspect it does." From that night onward, their relationship changed, not into equality. That would have been absurd. Dumbledore was still Dumbledore, older, more knowledgeable, moving within circles of history Harry could only partly see, but not into paternal concealment either. It became something closer to controlled collaboration. There were still secrets. Harry hated that. Dumbledore still believed some burdens ripened poorly when distributed too early. Harry thought that logic sound in some cases and self-excusing in others. Yet from then on, they argued in terms of method, not merely permission. Harry preferred that immensely. The release of the Umbridge file came in spring. Harry chose the date only after Hermione, Ron, and two other trusted members of Dumbledore's army had pressure-tested the logic 3 separate times. The target was not the public first. The public consumed scandal badly. It sensationalized before it analyzed. The better route was structural embarrassment. Harry had identified 3 Wisengamot members whose voting records over 15 years showed an unusual and very specific pattern. Low personal loyalty to Fudge, repeated preference for procedural integrity, and enough reputation for seriousness that being seen to ignore documented misconduct would damage them more than addressing it. He also identified 2 ministry legal clerks, known for despising sloppy decree drafting, and 1 journalist at the Daily Prophet, whose public caution concealed a private devotion to paper trails. The file went to all 6 on the same night through 4 separate routes, none directly traceable to students. Hermione handled copy integrity. Ron handled physical delivery in one instance via a chain of older brothers so tangled that even Harry lost track halfway through and gave up trying. Harry handled the cover memorandum. It was only 2 pages, clear, cold, specific. No melodrama, no pleading, a summary of misconduct, legal overreach, abuse of minors under ministry authority, and the reputational consequences of institutional inaction if corroborated evidence emerged elsewhere. At the bottom, he signed nothing. Sherlock had once told him that anonymity was most effective when the content itself made identity irrelevant. By breakfast, 2 days later, the castle felt different by lunchtime. Umbridge had screamed at 2 owls and a ministry messenger in full view of students. By the following week, she was removed, not in disgrace loud enough to satisfy Harry's emotional preferences. Not with a full public hearing, though he would have enjoyed one. But removed, isolated, and quietly disowned by the very apparatus she had served. Ron nearly danced in the corridor. Hermione permitted herself 12 full seconds of triumph before insisting they secure the file archive properly against retaliation. Harry stood by a window overlooking the grounds and watched the carriages move in the distance, feeling something cleaner than victory, completion. There was a difference. Ron, still grinning, came to stand beside him. That felt good. Harry shook his head slightly. It felt correct. Ron considered that. You know, one day I'm going to say something emotional and you're going to answer like a normal person. Harry looked at him. Unlikely. Ron laughed, and for a moment the war seemed a little less inevitable than it had that morning. That mattered too. 6th year brought Draco Malfoy into the center of the board. Harry had been studying Draco for years by then, though not in the way most of his classmates would have meant. Draco was not a rival in Harry's mind. He was a case study in inheritance under pressure. Children raised inside ideological structures often mistook language for belief. They spoke the creed they were handed because speech was how family taught belonging. The real test came later, when ideology demanded action costly enough to strip performance away. By 16, Draco Malfoy was reaching that line. Harry saw it before most people because he knew how to watch for the difference between arrogance and stress. Draco was still arrogant, certainly, still cruel often enough to deserve contempt on merit. But something else had entered him that year, a fracture under the performance, a thinning of certainty, a private terror poorly hidden beneath insult. The signs accumulated, visible exhaustion despite increased grooming. Rapid swings between bravado and hollow distraction. A grade trajectory inconsistent with claimed confidence. Repeated unsupervised movement patterns around the room of requirement and vanishing cabinet line. And most tellingly, fear whenever conversation drifted, even obliquely, toward family consequences. Ron wanted to hex him on principle. Hermione wanted tighter evidence. Harry wanted to know which way the fracture would run when forced. The opportunity came in late winter. Harry requested the meeting by indirect route in a location Draco could choose to ignore if he wished. No public stage, no witnesses in obvious range. An old classroom on the 7th floor, empty by design, with one lamp lit and one chair left opposite Harry's. Draco came 5 minutes late, which Harry interpreted as deliberate attempt to recover status after agreeing at all. He entered with his wand already in hand. Harry remained seated. "That's unhelpful," Draco said at once. "You're frightened," Harry replied. Draco's expression sharpened with instant fury. "And you're insufferable. Also true." For a moment Draco seemed to lose track of the script he had meant to perform. Harry let the silence work. It was one of Sherlock's most useful lessons. People rushed to fill silence when their prepared identity began to fail. "I suppose you've come to preach," Draco said finally. "No, to gloat." "No, to threaten me with saintly concern," Harry considered. "That phrase suggests you've been thinking about concern more than you'd like." Draco's mouth tightened. "Get to the point." Harry folded his hands. "The point," he said, "is that I know what he asked you to do." Every muscle in Draco's face changed. There it was, not surprise at being accused. Relief and fear at being accurately seen. Harry continued before denial could reassemble. "I know you haven't done it. I know you've tried alternatives. I know your family situation has degraded over the last 18 months and that your father's standing is compromised enough to create direct pressure on you. I know your mother is frightened. I know you are under surveillance from your own side as much as ours." He tilted his head slightly. "And I know that, despite 6 years of declaring how much better you are than everyone else, you are not, in fact, a murderer by temperament." Draco's hand shook once around the wand. "Don't," he said hoarsely. "Say her name." Harry had not said Narcissa's. Interesting. So the mother was the pressure point stronger even than the father. Harry noted it and continued. "You are looking for a way to obey without becoming the kind of person this task would require." Draco laughed then, a short broken sound with no amusement in it. "You always talk like you're reading a report." "That is because I usually am." "And what," Draco said, stepping closer, "makes you think you know anything about what I'd require?" Harry met his eyes. "Because if you truly intended to kill Dumbledore, you would be calmer." The silence after that was almost visible. Draco stared at him as though the room had altered shape. Then, very quietly, "Why are you here?" There it was. Not "how do you know," not "what do you want," "why are you here?" The question of a person who has privately ceased believing rescue exists and therefore mistrusts its appearance. Harry answered with full honesty. "Because destroying you is inefficient," he said. "And because I think you know that whatever you've been raised to call strength, this isn't it." Draco looked away. For a few seconds the only sound in the room was the lamp's faint hiss. Harry chose his next words with absolute care. "I'm offering you a way out," he said. "Not absolution, not friendship, a way out, information channel, limited immunity conditional on cooperation. Protection for your mother where possible. Your father's situation is structurally worse, and I won't lie about that. But if you continue on the current line, you destroy yourself and fail anyway. If you step sideways now, you live long enough to decide who you are when he isn't standing over you." Draco's face had gone very white. "You think he can be beaten?" Harry did not dramatize the answer. "Yes," he said. "I do." Draco studied him for a long time. Harry let him, because this was not a conversation won by rhetoric. It was a structural proposition offered to someone raised inside a failing system. Draco had to see not merely that Harry meant it, but that Harry's confidence came from somewhere stronger than hope. At last, Draco said, "You trust me?" "No." That startled a real sound out of him, almost a laugh. Harry went on. "Trust is a separate question. I'm offering a controlled exchange based on converging interest. You want your family to survive. I want Voldemort's coalition to fracture. Those goals overlap." Draco looked down at the wand in his hand as though noticing it for the first time. Then he sat, not all the way. Not surrender, just enough. Harry very quietly began outlining terms. The Draco Channel became one of the most delicate operations Harry ever ran. Hermione objected first on moral and practical grounds. Then, once the structure was explained, objected only on practical grounds. Ron objected on the entirely defensible basis that Draco Malfoy had spent 6 years being Draco Malfoy, and therefore any arrangement involving him felt like building a staircase out of wet paper. Harry agreed with all of this. Then he proceeded anyway, because the strategic logic was sound. Draco did not become good. Harry would have distrusted such a transformation at once. He became what frightened young men under ideological collapse often became when given a narrow exit path. Inconsistent, useful, bitter, ashamed, occasionally brave, and permanently difficult to classify in ordinary moral language. He passed information in fragments, movement expectations, mood shifts inside Slytherin, names spoken with too much caution, proof of which Death Eaters were already calculating private fallback positions if Voldemort's return produced more instability than advantage. It was not enough to win alone. It was enough to make Harry's coalition map stop being theory. And once the map became predictive, Voldemort's organization began to lose its greatest advantage, mystique. You could fear what you understood, but you could not mythologize it as easily. Harry thought that mattered enormously. By the end of 6th year, the conflict had changed shape again. Horcruxes were no longer only archival targets, they were active objectives. The Ministry was no longer simply cowardly, it was porous. The Order of the Phoenix, for all its bravery, remained strategically messy in ways Harry found both infuriating and oddly human. They were courageous, but courage tended to make people overvalue improvisation. Harry valued preparation. So he began, gradually and without fanfare, building something adjacent to the Order without ever fully naming it as separate, not a rebellion. Not a rival command, a method, small teams briefed only to scope relevant to task. Better evidence storage, redundant communication routes, documentation protocols, cross-checking of field claims before acting on them. Hermione as deputy in all but title, because anyone failing to recognize her that way simply did not understand how the world worked. Dumbledore knew. Of course he knew. One evening after a late meeting, when most of the castle slept, and Fawkes watched them both with bright, patient eyes, Dumbledore looked over a stack of Harry's structured notes and said, almost to himself, "You are building an investigative department in the middle of a war." Harry looked up from the table. "The war requires one." Dumbledore smiled faintly. "I suspect it does." There was no rebuke in his tone, only something like weary admiration. Harry thought, not for the first time, that the old man understood him better after every disagreement. That, too, was useful. The year ended not with peace, but with readiness. Harry stood one evening at a high window in Hogwarts with the latest version of the Coalition map in his hands, the Horcrux ledger in Hermione's script tucked beneath it, and a short coded note from Draco burned after memorization in the grate at his back. The grounds below were dark. The lake held the sky in broken pieces. Somewhere in the castle, Ron was arguing loudly with a suit of armor that had developed opinions. Somewhere else Hermione was almost certainly still awake, recalculating risk tables she claimed were rough estimates, and Harry knew were more accurate than half the Ministry's official figures. The file in his hand no longer resembled anything a schoolboy should have been carrying. That fact no longer shocked him. He had long since stopped waiting for adulthood to arrive as permission. Some cases simply began before the world believed you old enough to notice them. He thought of Sherlock, then not sentimentally, never that, but with the deep internal steadiness Baker Street always gave him. Sherlock would have called this the stage at which a case ceased being about discovery and became about arrangement. Not what happened, not who did it, but in what order the truths must be forced into the light so that denial lost all structural support. Arrangement. Harry liked that word. Below it all lay the central fact, hard and cold and now familiar enough not to frighten him every waking minute. A fragment of Voldemort remained in his scar. Not master, not destiny. Evidence. Dangerous evidence, yes, but evidence still. He would solve that too. He intended to solve all of it, the Horcruxes, the Coalition, the Ministry's rot, the myth of invincibility. The old story, everyone else kept trying to drag him into, in which boys won wars by being willing to die beautifully enough. Harry rejected that story on principle. He preferred survivable solutions. The file pages shifted under his thumb. He looked down at the top sheet, and because he had been raised in Baker Street and therefore processed difficult things best by naming them cleanly, he wrote one final note across the margin: current assessment. Order intact but strategically porous. Ministry unstable. Death Eater coalition vulnerable at status and family lines. Malfoy channel active. Proceed to final disruption phase. He capped the pen. Then he stood there a while longer in the dark, not dramatic, not heroic, simply patient. That was the thing most people misunderstood about dismantling powerful systems. It was rarely done with a single strike. You observed, you documented, you separated structure from noise, you found the weak joints. And then, when the weight shifted, you made sure it shifted all at once. Harry closed the file. Somewhere beyond the walls of Hogwarts, Tom Riddle's surviving self was still moving pieces, still trusting in fear, still mistaking theatricality for permanence. Harry Potter, standing in the window light with the habits of Sherlock Holmes woven into the way he held still and thought, felt something that was not optimism and not vengeance. It was something better, confidence in the shape of the case. And in war, as in murder, that was often the beginning of the end. Chapter 6, the final deduction by the time Harry Potter entered his 7th year. The war had ceased to resemble the stories people preferred telling about wars. It had very little to do with banners, speeches, noble despair, or the dramatic weather that historians always seem to add afterward as though clouds had opinions on moral struggle. It had to do with lists, timelines, missing objects, compromised officials, asset movement, communication routes, contradictions in testimony, the emotional tolerances of frightened men, the carrying capacity of old loyalties under new pressure. In other words, it had become a case, a vast one, a vicious one. But still, at its core, a case. Harry understood cases. That was useful, because the summer before 7th year took from him the last illusion that anyone else would simplify the work on his behalf. Dumbledore died in June. The official public story was confused within hours and politicized within 2 days. By the end of the week, the wizarding world had already begun doing what frightened societies always did with difficult truths, reorganizing them into competing myths. Some said Dumbledore had fallen in a duel, some that he had been betrayed by one of his own, some that the school itself had been compromised beyond recovery. Nearly all the stories were wrong in the ways that mattered most. Harry knew better, because Harry had been inside the structure of the thing before it happened, not the full structure. Dumbledore had remained Dumbledore to the last, still willing to share more than before, still unwilling to share everything. But enough. Enough for Harry to know that Draco Malfoy had been given an impossible task, and had, in the end, failed in the precise moral sense Harry had predicted he would fail. He could not bring himself to become a killer under observation, not even to save himself from the man commanding him to do it. Enough for Harry to know that Snape's role was deeper, uglier, and more strategically necessary than almost anyone would ever be able to bear knowing in full. Enough for Harry to understand that Dumbledore, already dying by then from damage bound up with the ring Horcrux they had tracked together that spring, had chosen his end not as surrender but as arrangement. He had, Harry thought, with some pain and some admiration, converted his own death into evidence management. It was infuriating. It was also exactly the sort of thing Harry might one day have done himself if forced. That recognition unsettled him more than the grief did. He had not cried when Dumbledore's body was found below the astronomy tower. He had been too busy counting, cross-checking, and holding still while the world around him became noise. He cried later in smaller ways. Once in the boys' dormitory with the curtains drawn and Ron pretending not to notice. Once in the library after Hermione found him staring at Dumbledore's last marked-up note on wand allegiance and quietly sat beside him until the silence broke on its own. Once, unexpectedly, in Baker Street over Christmas, when Mrs. Hudson asked whether the old man had at least taken proper meals. And the absurdity of the question opened something in Harry's chest he had been keeping under control by sheer structure. Sherlock watched this without comment for nearly a minute. Then he said, "Death rearranges a case. It does not erase the work." Harry had nodded because that was true. Then, because Baker Street had always allowed truth without performance, he sat in the armchair by the fire and let grief happen without having to make it useful. The next morning he returned to work. Dumbledore would have approved of that, Harry suspected. He was not sure he forgave him for being the kind of man who would approve of that. The first weeks after Dumbledore's death were devoted to consolidation. If a coalition lost its central elder strategist, opportunists moved. Loyalists panicked. Double agents became brittle. Frightened institutions accelerated their stupidity in an attempt to disguise fear as decisiveness. Harry knew all of this. He had written variants of it in the margins of 3 separate case files over the previous 2 years. The difference now was that he could no longer assume anyone else was holding the full map. So he did what he had learned to do whenever the world threatened to become story-shaped. He reduced it back to components. At Grimmauld Place, in the old dining room that still smelled faintly of dust and family poison despite Mrs. Weasley's best efforts, Harry spread out the files and built the war again from first principles. Hermione sat at his right with the Horcrux ledger, Ron at his left with the coalition map, and a face that conveyed, at all times, the terrible burden of being the only person in the room who reacted to phrases like distributed mortality system with the appropriate level of human alarm. Ginny, when available, handled communications architecture because she had developed a gift for routing information through people who underestimated her, and then regretted it later. Neville handled local support networks and quiet school intelligence better than almost anyone, partly because people still mistook kindness for softness in his presence and learned otherwise too late. Luna, who treated reality as though it were always allowed to contain one more layer than most people had budgeted for, proved remarkably useful whenever the rest of them began mistaking their model of the situation for its total shape. The structure Harry built was not the Order. The Order was brave, broad, and strategically untidy. Harry loved many of its people. He would not have trusted it with all of his evidence. What he built instead was smaller, compartmentalized. Each person got what they needed, not what would make them feel included. Sherlock would have approved. Hermione sometimes disapproved on ethical texture. And then, after 2 hours of argument and a revised briefing protocol, approved of the improved version. Ron approved only insofar as it meant fewer people could accidentally tell secrets to idiots. Harry titled the operational sheet, "Final Disruption Phase." Ron read it and rubbed both hands down his face. "I'm begging you," he said, "to title one thing like a normal person before we all die." Hermione did not look up from the ledger. "It is a normal title. It sounds like a disease." Harry, rearranging the pages concerning Hufflepuff's cup, replied, "That is not inaccurate." Ron made a despairing noise at the ceiling. Ginny, leaning against the mantel, laughed outright. The laughter helped. Harry had learned over the past 2 years that morale was not sentiment. It was operational endurance wearing a friendlier face. People performed better when the work was not allowed to become total. Sherlock might have dismissed that as a Watsonism. Harry had long since concluded that Watsonisms kept more people alive than Sherlock ever admitted. So the work continued with tea, arguments, diagrams, jokes too dark to repeat outside trusted rooms, and the kind of affection that did not slow any of them down because it had long since stopped pretending affection and rigor were enemies. The Horcrux hunt did not proceed in the breathless, improvisational manner later accounts preferred. It was methodical. Harry insisted on that. By autumn, they had 3 certainties, 2 high-confidence hypotheses, and 1 unresolved central problem. Certainties: the diary had been destroyed in second year. The ring had been destroyed the previous summer, at catastrophic cost to Dumbledore's hand and eventually his life. The locket, recovered through a chain of evidence so convoluted that Ron once declared the object, more dramatic than any jewelry has the right to be, was now in their possession and awaiting proper destruction. High-confidence hypotheses. Hufflepuff's cup remained in a Gringotts vault, controlled through Lestrange family channels. Ravenclaw's lost diadem was somewhere at Hogwarts, because a provenance gap that large around an object that symbolically perfect was not a gap at all. It was concealment, unresolved central problem, Harry himself. The fragment in his scar remained the most difficult line in the audit, because all available evidence suggested structural difference. It had attached accidentally, under violent magical stress, to a living infant already marked by the rebounding curse. That made it neither a normal Horcrux nor safely classifiable as anything else. Harry had spent enough time thinking around it to know when thought risked curdling into obsession. Hermione helped there. She enforced intervals. She made him eat. She forced him, on one memorable afternoon, to stop rewriting the same 4 paragraphs on soul-binding asymmetry and go outside because your face has begun to look like a footnote. Ron, overhearing this, said, "That is the cruelest thing you've ever said to him." Hermione did not blink. "It's also correct." Harry went outside. The locket's destruction confirmed one important piece of theory and introduced another. They destroyed it in a ruined outbuilding on Weasley land under overlapping wards, and with every known precaution short of inviting the entire Wisengamot to witness and be useful for once. The Sword of Gryffindor, already identified as uniquely capable of destroying Horcrux class objects due to its basilisk venom saturation, did the work. But not before the locket did what the diary had done, and what Harry had come to understand Horcruxes always did when threatened. It weaponized knowledge. It showed them things. Not true things, at least not in the crude visual sense. Rather emotionally engineered projections built from insecurities, grief, envy, and whatever vile sensitivity the fragment retained to the minds around it. Ron took the worst of it because the locket understood at once what kind of wound would cut deepest in a boy who loved fiercely while suspecting, beneath all that love, that he might always come second to someone else's legend. Ron came through it because Ron Weasley, for all his gift for feeling everything at once and resenting people on schedule before forgiving them completely, possessed one priceless quality most cunning enemies underestimated in him. When it mattered, he chose. Once chosen, he was nearly impossible to move. He stabbed the locket through the center while the projection was still whispering humiliations at him. The scream it made was not human. When it was over, the outbuilding smelled of metal, ozone, and the kind of magic that wanted to leave residue on thought as much as stone. Harry logged the spectrometer readings. Hermione secured the remains. Ron sat down hard on a crate and said after a long silence, "I hate all of these things personally." Harry, still staring at the dead fragment as black smoke twisted itself into nothing, answered with perfect sincerity, "That is an analytically sound response." Ron laughed so abruptly he nearly choked on it. That mattered too. The cup came next. Gringotts was harder, not because breaking into it was impossible, but because Gringotts had spent centuries constructing a reputation designed to make people believe impossible and inadvisable were synonyms. Harry did not accept that sort of thing without testing it. He built the vault plan in 4 phases: information, access assumptions, misdirection, exit probabilities. Hermione improved phase 1 by 30% simply by being more relentless than the Goblin-authored records had anticipated anyone outside Goblin finance ever being. Ron improved phase 3 by virtue of having brothers whose histories of improvised criminality turned out, in retrospect, to have been an excellent apprenticeship for thinking laterally about security theater. Fleur de Lacquer, drawn in because precise curse-breaking expertise had become less optional with every passing month, improved phases 2 and 4 so significantly that Harry rewrote the entire margin note under her name from specialist support to never conduct a high-risk magical extraction without consulting her first. The operation succeeded in the exact way good operations often did. Untidily, expensively, but in overall accordance with the planned failure tolerances, they got the cup. They did not get out cleanly. Harry never forgot the dragon. Not because dragons were dramatic, they were, but that never impressed him by itself. He remembered it because the creature had been built into the system as pure coercive architecture. Pain converted into defense mechanism. Terror industrialized. Seeing it chained and brutalized clarified something in him he had not known still needed clarifying. Bad systems, he thought later, always revealed themselves most honestly in how they treated the things they believed too powerful to deserve mercy. He documented that thought, and then, because the cup mattered more than the philosophy of banking violence while the roof was still collapsing around them, he and the others got out alive. The cup died beneath the sword with less spectacle than the locket, which Harry found interesting. Hufflepuff's relic seemed to resist by compression rather than projection, as though the fragment inside it had learned different defensive habits from living in hoarded gold and inherited entitlement. He wrote 3 pages on contextual artifact influence before Hermione took the pen out of his hand and pointed out that they were currently in hiding and not at leisure for an essay. He conceded the point. The diadem took them back to Hogwarts. Harry had suspected the castle for over 2 years. The proof came, fittingly, from a contradiction in one of Tom Riddle's old movement patterns and a memory Slughorn let slip while drunk enough to confuse Harry with a much less troublesome variety of student. Tom had once asked about ancient magical relics with the smooth, feigned academic curiosity of someone already planning theft. More importantly, he had specifically asked about places in the castle where things disappeared because the castle collected forgotten objects. Only one place fit. The room of requirement did not delight Harry. It irritated him, which in some ways was better. He did not trust magic that responded too elegantly to need without declaring its mechanisms. Nonetheless, when the diadem revealed itself under layers of old dust and hidden clutter, he experienced the sharp satisfaction that always came when theory condensed into fact. The object was beautiful in a cold, superior sort of way. Gemmed, silvered, made to imply intellect as crown. That is exactly the kind of thing he would choose, Hermione said, staring at it with deep disgust. Yes, Harry replied. Ravenclaw's lost wisdom, appropriated by a man whose defining trait was confusing cleverness with superiority. Psychologically coherent. Ron picked up a broken bit of cabinet wood and pointed at the diadem as though warding off evil. Could you not profile the artifact while it's still trying to be cursed at us? It was a fair point. They destroyed it on sight because moving Horcruxes had by then begun to feel like inviting venomous spiders into one's pockets for convenience. Fiendfire, in Harry's judgment, remained a reckless and vile method under almost every imaginable condition. Under this one, with controlled barriers and Hermione's mathematical precision keeping the conjuration within hard limits, it was acceptable. The diadem cracked, blackened, screamed once in a voice too high to be entirely human, and collapsed into slag. By then only 2 remained, Nagini, Harry. Nagini forced the war out of its remaining ambiguity. Unlike the object Horcruxes, she moved, protected herself, and functioned as both weapon and container. Harry had written years earlier that a living Horcrux was the most elegant option from an engineering standpoint. Seeing it in operation did not improve his opinion of the designer. The snake rarely left Voldemort's immediate sphere once the coalition began to fracture visibly. Bellatrix dead. Several mid-level loyalists hedging. Malfoy channels producing less information not because Draco had betrayed them, but because Voldemort increasingly trusted fewer people. The system, under pressure, had begun the usual authoritarian retreat toward paranoia. Useful, also dangerous. By spring, the ministry had gone from porous to captured. not entirely. Harry never accepted totalizing narratives when partial ones would do. There were still good people inside it, still clerks who leaked papers, still lower-level officials quietly choosing sabotage over obedience when they could do so without becoming martyrs for no gain. But the public face was gone, and with it the last argument that this could be handled as a contained insurgency. Harry responded by doing what Voldemort least expected anyone to do. He built documentation for public release, not for the final hour alone. In stages, evidence archives, financial trails, histories of coercion. The Umbridge file expanded into a larger ministry corruption dossier. Draco's intelligence, sanitized and cross-confirmed until no single compromised source could destroy its credibility. Snape's hidden channel, agonizingly incomplete from Harry's point of view, and apparently destined to remain so, nonetheless allowed enough precision in certain operations to make Harry suspect Dumbledore had hidden entire strategic conversations inside casual remarks years ago just to infuriate him from beyond the grave. Hermione became by then what everyone with eyes had long known she was, deputy by function if not by title. She handled evidence integrity, redundancy, and the unbearable burden of telling Harry when a theory he loved had outrun the support required to operationalize it. He, in turn, trusted her corrections faster than he trusted his own certainty whenever the case touched the scar. Ron became what he always had been beneath everyone's habit of underestimating him. The indispensable human calibration point in a room full of people who could think themselves clean out of common sense if not watched closely. He knew when fear in a crowd would mutate into stampede. He knew when a plan required more people to believe in it than actually would. He knew when a room needed laughter before anyone there could keep going. Luna became an expert in inconvenient perception. Neville became what quiet courage often became if given enough time and enough cause. Devastatingly reliable. Ginny became sharp enough that Harry eventually stopped mentally categorizing her as support and started categorizing half his plans as needing to survive her critique before they deserved to be called plans at all. These were not the companions of legend. They were better than that. They were collaborators. Harry trusted collaborators. The solution to the Elder Wand came from a footnote. This was, Harry felt, thematically satisfying. Ollivander had written, decades earlier, a paper on wand lineage and transfer conditions in non-lethal mastery events. The paper itself was dense, careful, and criminally underread. Buried near the end was a discussion of constructive defeat. The condition by which a wand's allegiance could shift not merely through disarming in the theatrical dual sense, but through an incontrovertible collapse of strategic superiority recognized in the deep magical logic of contest and dominance. Most people, Harry thought, had missed the importance because they were too busy looking for stories. Wands, like legal codes, cared less about narrative than threshold conditions. That insight arrived at the exact moment Draco's reports and Snape's last usable signal both indicated the same thing. Voldemort believed the Elder Wand his. He believed, more importantly, that possession plus murder had closed the chain. Harry did not because of prophecy, not because of destiny, because he had actually followed the evidence. Draco had disarmed Dumbledore. Harry had later established mastery over Draco under conditions the wand world's own internal logic would recognize. Therefore, the Elder Wand did not answer to Voldemort. That alone might have sufficed in a simpler war. Harry did not trust sufficiency where certainty might be built. So he designed a second layer. The resonance chamber beneath the Great Hall took 4 months to build in secret and would have been impossible without Hermione's calculations, Fleur's curse-breaking precision, and assistance from 3 people in the castle's maintenance network, whose loyalty Harry secured not through rhetoric, but through evidence of exactly what a Voldemort victory would mean for everyone not pure blood enough, rich enough, or coward enough to be temporarily useful. The chamber's function was simple to describe and nightmarish to construct. It would, under precisely calibrated conditions, interact with a killing curse discharged by the Elder Wand in such a way as to strip the wand's projected allegiance from its false holder by forcing a conflict between claimed mastery and actual chain logic. Not a reversal, not a rebound. A legal challenge, expressed in magical terms. Hermione once described the design as weaponized citation. Harry thought that was one of the best phrases anyone had ever coined. The only remaining requirements were these: Nagini had to die. The scar fragment had to be severable without killing Harry. Voldemort had to be maneuvered into the hall under conditions where he believed he was dictating the scene. The first problem solved itself sooner than Harry liked and bloodier than he preferred. Neville Longbottom killed Nagini in the middle of battle, in smoke and noise and broken stone, and with a kind of blazing refusal that would have looked mythical in any retelling. Harry, who was 20 yards away and covered in dust, blood, and 3 days' accumulated exhaustion at the time, saw it with much more practical clarity. Neville had identified the vulnerable interval. He had the right weapon. He acted before fear caught up. Excellent field work. He hugged Neville afterward with enough force to nearly crack both their ribs. Neville laughed and then, very suddenly, cried into Harry's shoulder for 6 seconds before mastering himself again. Harry did not mention it, neither did Neville. Some evidence, Watson would have said, did not require filing to be real. The second problem, Harry's scar, was solved by a thing Dumbledore had left hidden inside a note so infuriatingly cryptic that Harry spent the first 10 minutes after deciphering it contemplating whether the dead should be allowed to receive stern letters. The note directed him to a specific memory archive, a specific sequence of pensive records, and a specific passage in a pre-modern healing treatise on parasitic soul binding. Combined, they established what Dumbledore had suspected but refused to assert without proof: that an accidental fragment attached to a living child could be severed if the host were subjected to a targeted curse event under conditions of external sacrifice substitution, that is, if the fragment, not the host, became the magical object recognized as the valid recipient of lethal intent. In plainer language, Voldemort had to try to kill Harry using Harry's own marked connection as pathway, and the ritual conditions surrounding the act had to bias the curse toward the foreign fragment rather than the native soul. It was revoltingly complex. It was also the first plausible non-fatal solution Harry had ever seen. Hermione read the full analysis once, twice, then sat down and put both hands over her face. "Can it work?" she asked through her fingers. Harry thought of all the places uncertainty still lived in the margins. "Yes," he said at last. "I think so." Hermione lowered her hands. Her eyes were red. "I am going to say something very calmly," she said. "If you die because an elderly genius with boundary issues left you a puzzle instead of a plan, I will personally rearrange the afterlife." Ron, leaning against a cracked pillar nearby, nodded. "Same." Harry, despite everything, laughed. Then they finalized the trap. The message to Voldemort was 4 sentences long. Harry wrote it himself. The wording mattered more than any speech he had ever given, because speeches were for audiences, and this was for one man only. A man so pathologically centralized in his own imagination that he mistook every major event in history for a footnote to his psychology. So Harry fed that. He framed the confrontation as inevitable, singular, and final. He implied exclusive knowledge. He placed it at Hogwarts, because Voldemort's sense of symbolic completion was almost as strong as his fear of death. He allowed just enough truth to make the rest irresistible. The channel through which the message moved was one Voldemort's intelligence network had already proven it trusted. Harry was careful about that too. You did not send bait directly to a predator. You let it travel through the paths the predator already believed were his. Voldemort came. Of course he came. By then the castle was half battle, half crime scene. Corridors broken open, towers burning in parts, stone dust in the air. portraits shrieking contradictory advice, spells flying through old architecture that objected to being made relevant in this way. The dead already numbered more than Harry had had time to properly count, and that fact sat at the back of his mind like iron. He did not suppress grief, he deferred it. There was a difference. The great hall had been cleared according to plan, not emptied truly. Nothing important was ever truly empty, but cleared of obvious presence. The upper galleries held watchers, fighters, couriers, archivists, and 3 people whose sole task was to release evidence packages the instant Voldemort's strategic invincibility broke. Fleur and Hermione had activated the resonance architecture from separate points. Ron controlled the fallback routes. Ginny oversaw the media release timing with a face so hard and focused, Harry thought fleetingly that anyone who still imagined her a side character deserved whatever she chose to do with that error later. Harry walked into the hall alone, or apparently alone. That was enough. Voldemort entered as though the room already belonged to him. He was at his most dangerous when theatricality and calculation aligned. White-faced, red-eyed, wand in hand, the serpent gone now, though Harry knew he did not yet know that in full. Behind him, at controlled distances, stood the remnants of his certainty. A few true zealots, a few trapped collaborators, a few men already looking for exits in their own heads. Harry saw Malfoy among neither group. Good. No wand, Voldemort observed, gliding forward into the candlelight and broken stone. No defenders, no old men to sacrifice themselves for you. At last, Harry Potter, only the 2 of us. Harry held his gaze. Not quite, he said. It was an honest answer, though not in the way Voldemort assumed. There were 17 people in position throughout the castle. There were 3 independent evidence release routes. There were traitors prepared to stand down the instant the center broke. There was a resonance chamber under Voldemort's feet keyed to a wand he did not truly own. There was, most importantly, 7 years of casework arranged so that one man's collapse would trigger a coalition's panic. Only the 2 of us, thought Harry. Yes, and also everyone else you forgot was real. Voldemort smiled thinly. Still riddles. No, Harry said. Conclusions? The smile altered. Irritation, curiosity, the old blend. Harry continued because talking was not stalling now. Talking was part of the mechanism. I know what you are, he said. Not in the way people usually mean, not myth, not title, structure. I know how you persisted. I know what you made. I know what you chose and why you chose it. I know where you were vain and where you were careful. I know the difference. For the first time, a flicker of true attention crossed Voldemort's face. You presume much. I documented much. Voldemort's wand shifted slightly. Good, Harry thought. Let him listen. Let vanity force him to remain. I have followed you, Harry said. From the orphanage to Hogwarts, through your first performances, your early acquisitions, your shop years, your disappearances, your returns. I've read what you wrote when you believed yourself hidden. I've studied what you chose to preserve. I've interviewed the people you thought too small to matter after you were finished with them. Harry took one step forward. You built your life as a trail of monuments and assumed no one would ever call them evidence. Voldemort's eyes narrowed. Something in the hall shifted, not physically, psychologically. Several of the Death Eaters behind him had begun listening in the wrong way now, not for orders but for information. Harry heard one breath catch sharply. Good. You think words win wars? Voldemort asked softly. No, Harry said. But accurate words reorganize them. Then he gave the final cut. Nagini is dead. The reaction was immediate, involuntary, perfect. It was not on Voldemort's face first, it was in the men behind him. One flinched. Another turned a fraction toward the side doors by instinct. A third Yaxley. Harry thought distantly went still in the particular way of a man suddenly recalculating personal survival. Voldemort's expression hardened into something beyond anger. Harry saw it then, with the strange clarity that came only in moments of terminal convergence. The coalition knew. Or if not knew, feared enough to act as though they did. The center had cracked. Lies, Voldemort said, but the word lacked the effortless certainty he had built his entire public self upon. Harry answered at once. No, as are the rest, the ring, the diary, the locket, the cup. The diadem. Every external anchor you trusted. Gone. He did not mention the scar, not yet. Voldemort's face changed, not to fear. Voldemort's fear rarely showed so simply. It changed to incomprehension violated by evidence. The expression of a man discovering, perhaps for the first time in his life, that someone else had actually followed the chain all the way through. This is impossible, Harry thought with an almost private coldness. That is the sentence weak cases always force from arrogant men when the file lands in front of them. You say that, he replied, because you never considered the possibility that another person might be more patient than you. The wand came up. At last. This was the point at which every simpler story would have become a duel. Harry had no interest in simpler stories. He moved exactly as planned, one step to the marked point inset invisibly in the stone. Left shoulder angled, scar exposed to the line of fire. Wandless, because the resonance challenge required the Elder Wand to assert false dominance over an apparently undefended enemy whose real defense lay beneath and around, not in hand. Voldemort's voice split the whole. Avada Kedavra, green light. There are experiences language serves badly because language was built for events ordinary enough to repeat. The curse crossed the hall, and for a fraction of a second that felt longer than several years, Harry understood three things at once. First, the resonance chamber activated, not with noise, with a sensation like enormous legal machinery suddenly engaging beneath reality itself. A contract challenged, a title disputed, an authority asked with relentless precision to produce its actual chain. Second, the scar erupted into white-hot pain unlike anything he had ever endured. Not pain of burning or cutting, pain of separation. Of something foreign being named foreign under force too exact to resist. Third, the Elder Wand rejected the simplification Voldemort had built around it. The green struck. The hall convulsed with light. Harry did fall, though not backward as later paintings insisted. He dropped to one knee with his hand to the scar, vision fractured into gold and black, and a sharp, cooling wire sensation just above his right eye. Across from him Voldemort staggered, not thrown, not blasted theatrically through stone, but interrupted. As though the wand had completed the curse only under protest, and then withdrawn every false assumption from the act. There came a sound then, very small and very terrible, not from Harry. From the air immediately around him, a tearing whisper. A fragment leaving, Harry felt the foreign presence rip loose. He nearly blacked out, did not, forced air into lungs that had forgotten for half a second what lungs were for, raised his head. Voldemort was on one knee. The Elder Wand lay several feet away from his hand. He was staring at the empty space where certainty had been. Harry knew professionally that this was the crucial instant, not because the villain was weakened, because the witnesses were watching. He stood, slowly, because his body demanded the dignity of difficulty, and he had no time to negotiate with it. Blood from the reopened scar ran warm down the side of his face. He wiped it away with the back of his hand and kept moving until he stood over Voldemort at a distance neither merciful nor theatrical. Exact. "It's over," Harry said. Voldemort looked up at him with something close to hatred and something closer still to disbelief. "No." "Yes." Harry turned deliberately, enough that the hall could hear him and the hidden recorders in the galleries could catch every word. "The wand never answered to you," he said. "You followed murder where you should have followed mastery. You trusted possession where you should have examined evidence. The chain passed through Dumbledore, through Draco Malfoy, to me. The chamber beneath this floor challenged your false claim, and the wand agreed. The last fragment in me is gone. The others are gone. There is no mechanism left supporting your survival except the bodies still willing to die for a dead idea." Behind Voldemort, 3 wands lowered, then 2 more. Harry saw the exact moment the coalition ceased believing itself collective. It was subtle, not dramatic. One person stepped back. Another did not move to cover him. A third looked not to Voldemort but to the nearest exit and realized no one would stop him if he ran because everyone else was making the same calculation at once. Perfect. You built everything, Harry said quietly, looking back down at Voldemort, on fear. Fear of death, fear of irrelevance, fear in other people, harvested and organized until you mistook it for loyalty. Fear is efficient in the short term. It is also unstable. All anyone had to do was show the structure underneath. Voldemort's face twisted. I am Lord Voldemort. Harry shook his head once. No, he said, you're Tom Riddle, and this is the end of the case. The Aurors entered then not the whole official apparatus, never that, but the subset already primed by Harry's evidence packages, and the surviving network of people inside the ministry who had chosen, when the moment arrived, not to be on the wrong side of documented history. The hall became noise again after that, shouting, disarms. 2 brief duels in the side aisle. Bellatrix's remaining loyalists trying to convert a collapse into martyrdom and failing because martyrdom, like every other form of theater, required an audience still emotionally invested in the script. Kingsley taking charge of containment before anyone could pretend politics had not just changed. Fleur and Hermione emerging from opposite sides of the chamber floor, both pale, both wild-eyed, both furiously alive. Ron reaching Harry first, grabbing both his shoulders, and swearing at him with the intimacy of someone who had come within inches of watching the world make him the object of history again. You idiot, Ron said, voice breaking. You absolute— I know, Harry said. Ron hugged him hard enough to bruise. Harry returned it without dignity because dignity had become a secondary concern somewhere around the line where his forehead had stopped containing someone else's soul. Hermione reached them half a second later and did not bother pretending composure. She touched the scar, checked his pupils, whispered, stay upright through teeth clenched hard enough to crack, and then kissed his cheek once, fierce and furious and relieved, before stepping back and saying, in a voice of astonishing steadiness, we have 6 evidence releases already confirmed. The 7th is delayed because the Northern Relay Owl was injured, but Ginny rerouted through the radio channel. Harry stared at her for 1 second, then began laughing. It was not a calm sound. Ron and Hermione both looked at him as though he'd finally gone mad. The owl, Harry managed. Hermione, still furious, stared back. Then the absurdity reached her too, and she laughed as well, one hand over her mouth and tears in her eyes. That, Harry thought dimly, was probably how he knew they had actually survived. Not because the danger was gone, because absurdity had returned. Only living people got to find war ridiculous in fragments. The aftermath was administrative. That was, in many ways, Harry's favorite part, not emotionally. Nothing involving the dead, the broken, and the stunned living could ever be easy. But administrative aftermath had rules. Evidence moved, responsibility attached, liabilities surfaced. Paperwork, however grim, acknowledged that the world had returned at least partly to the realm of systems rather than spectacle. Harry gave 3 major briefings in the first week. The first was to the emergency Wisengamot session. He did not grandstand. He had no taste for it. He provided the evidence archive in summary form, identified corroborated elements versus still pending confirmations, laid out the Horcrux mechanism without unnecessary metaphysics, and attached every relevant ministry failure in sequence so no one could later pretend Voldemort's second rise had been pure surprise. Several old men tried to interrupt. Hermione, seated 2 chairs behind him with the complete indexed archive, replied to each interruption by producing the supporting document before the sentence had quite finished. By the 4th time, no one interrupted her again. The second briefing was to the press. Harry took only journalists who had read the material first. He had inherited from Sherlock a permanent suspicion of reporters who wanted emotion faster than fact. The questions were intelligent. Some were painful. One woman from the Evening Prophet asked whether he resented having had so much hidden from him by people who claimed to protect him. Harry answered honestly, yes, and I also understand why fear makes good people justify bad information practices. I recommend fewer heroes and better disclosure policies. That quote followed him for years. The third briefing was the worst. Families of the dead. No archive softened that. No perfect chain of logic made loss less indecently human. Harry went because he would not allow the entire war to be converted into state language and symbolic funeral rhetoric. Facts belonged to victims too. He spoke carefully. He answered what he could. He did not offer nobility where what people had lost was a son, a daughter, a brother, a friend. He did not say they died for a cause unless the family said it first. He said names. He said what happened. He said, where possible and true, that they had not been stupid or unnecessary or forgotten. Afterward, alone for 6 minutes in a ministry side corridor, he leaned his head against the wall and closed his eyes. When he opened them, Sherlock Holmes was there. Not actually there, of course. Baker Street was hours away, and Sherlock only entered ministries when blackmail, homicide, or national embarrassment made avoidance impossible. But Harry heard him anyway, in memory clear as speech. Evidence is patient. Human beings are not. Account for both, so he did. He went back to Baker Street in August. The city was hot by London standards and smelled faintly of rain preparing itself. Mrs. Hudson opened the door before he could knock and gathered him in before he could deploy even one defensive sentence about being perfectly capable of standing on his own 2 feet. Watson embraced him next with less force and more professional checking than a normal person might have thought affectionate. Sherlock, waiting in the sitting room with tea set out and the newspapers folded aside, looked at the scar for exactly 3 seconds and said, "Reduced inflammation." "Good." Harry dropped into his old armchair and, for the first time in months, allowed himself to feel how tired he was. Sherlock slid a folder across the table. Harry blinked. "What's this?" "Your post-war planning errors," Sherlock said. Harry stared at him. Sherlock steepled his fingers. "Your war was adequate. Your peace planning remains sentimental in places." Harry opened the folder. Inside were 12 pages of notes in Sherlock's hand regarding Harry's preliminary proposal for a Department of Magical Investigation. An idea Harry had mentioned in one letter half-formed and not expected Sherlock to treat as a live design problem. The notes were brutal. Unclear chain of evidence custody in regional incidents, insufficient distinction between field aurors and forensic analysts, potential corruption, risk at interface with political office, training pipeline too dependent on individual talent and not enough on standardized observation method. Harry read 3 pages, then 5, then all 12. At the end, he looked up and found Sherlock watching him with that infuriatingly calm expression people mistook for indifference because they had never learned how much care could live inside rigor. "You've redesigned the whole thing," Harry said. "No," Sherlock replied. "I've corrected the parts that would embarrass you in 10 years. Harry felt something warm and painful and steady move through him all at once. He closed the folder carefully. Then, "I've been asked to lead it." "The investigative division," Sherlock said. "Yes." "You'll hate training incompetence." "Almost certainly. You'll do it anyway." "Yes." Sherlock inclined his head. "Good." Mrs. Hudson, appearing with a fresh plate of scones as if summoned by the precise emotional weight of the room, set them down and said, "Will you be staying for dinner, Harry?" Harry looked around, at the chemistry apparatus, at the books, at the violin on the chair, at the bullet-pocked corner of the periodic table from the experiment when he was 9. At Sherlock's old case thermometer still hanging absurdly on the wall because once, years ago, they had tracked the heat changes around an impossible chessboard accident and neither of them had ever thought to take it down. He looked at Watson, at Mrs. Hudson, at Sherlock. Then he answered with complete simplicity. "Yes," he said, "I'll stay for dinner." Sherlock, who would rather have swallowed a teaspoon than call that answer sentimental, reached for the teapot and said, "Good. There's a murder in Sussex with a forged blood pattern you may find restorative." Watson sighed. Mrs. Hudson swatted Sherlock with a dish towel. Harry laughed, tired and real and entirely alive. Outside, London moved through its ordinary evening. Cars, voices, rain beginning at last. Inside 221B Baker Street, the case notes on the table sat side by side, one in Sherlock's hand, one in Harry's, no longer easy to distinguish at a glance. That, Harry thought, was perhaps the final truth of it. He had not become Sherlock. No one should. The world could barely tolerate one. What Sherlock had given him was harder and better, method without worship, attention without superstition. The refusal to let power disguise itself as mystery simply because mystery frightened other people into politeness. That had saved Harry's life. More than that, it had let him save it without becoming the sort of symbol other people kept trying to make of him. Years later, when the Department of Magical Investigation became fully operational ahead of every bureaucrat's expectations, and to half their annoyance, people would say its founding director had impossible standards for evidence, a disconcerting habit of noticing everything, and a tendency to go very still in the middle of difficult cases, while everyone around him learned the wisdom of not interrupting. Hermione Granger, appointed deputy director because the alternative was idiotic, would say that Harry's stillness meant the case was organizing itself in his head, and that anyone who mistook it for passivity deserved the shock they were about to receive. Ron Weasley, consulting often enough to complain professionally about it, would say Harry thought like a trap disguised as a librarian. Ginny, when asked what had made the department different from the Aurors who came before, would answer more simply than any of them. "He doesn't care what the story says happened," she would say. "He cares what happened." And Sherlock Holmes, if cornered on the subject and denied escape, would say only this, adequate, which, in his language, meant everything.